Click it on there.
So sorry, Mr. Speaker. I believe my video is on, but it sounds as if you can't see me. Is that right?
The little camera has an X across it, or the red bar across it. Maybe if you can take a look or try it out.
I have.
Is something blocking it, or is another program using?
So, I'm sorry. If the Honourable Minister can maybe shut down other programs that she's got running, they may have hijacked the camera and taken over.
Thank you for the technical advice, Mr. Speaker. I will do what I can.
Okay.
And I apologize to colleagues.
Come on down.
I'm noticing on the screen that the actual camera has an X across it, or the red bar across it, meaning it's not working. Take a look. We've done that. We're good. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance has the floor. Please continue.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, colleagues in this House and Canadians, many apologies for the technical challenges. I have the honour to table in both official languages the Economic and Fiscal Update 2021. Pursuant to Standing Order 83.1, I wish to table a notice of a Ways and Means motion to implement certain provisions of the Economic and Fiscal Update tabled in Parliament on December 14th, 2021, and other measures. Pursuant to Standing Order 83.2, I ask that an order of the day be designated for consideration of the motion. J'ai aussi l'honneur de déposer un avis de motion des voix et moyennes en vue du dépôt d'une loi mettant en œuvre une taxe sur les services numériques. Je demande également que l'étude de cette motion soit inscrite à l'ordre du jour. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, et merci pour votre patience et la patience de tous les collègues
Thank you for your
dans la
patience,
Chambre.
and to all colleagues in the House for their patience.
Mr. Speaker?
Yes, please do. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
21 months ago, a global pandemic reached our shores. Few of us had any idea how long it would last or the toll it would take. And today, we are facing Omicron, an even more virulent variant of this virus. But we can be confident that we will get through this because our government did understand from the very outset that to save lives, our economy would have to be locked down. So we put in place unprecedented measures to meet this unprecedented challenge. We supported municipalities and we supported provinces and territories. We supported our healthcare system and we supported schools. We provided free vaccines and PPE and rapid tests and therapeutic medicines. Notre priorité
Our
était les
focus
gens
was
et
on
les
people
emplois.
and jobs.
Nous avons aidé
We
des
helped
millions de
millions of
Canadiennes et
Canadians
de Canadiens grâce à des
through
mesures
income
de soutien
supports.
aux revenus. Nous avons versé des
We
paiements
delivered
directs
direct
aux
payments
aînés
to
et aux
seniors
familles.
and families.
Nous avons aussi
We
aidé
also
les entreprises,
helped
en
companies,
particulier les petites
small
entreprises,
businesses in
à
particular,
poursuivre
to
leur
keep their doors
activité
open.
et aider les
And we
travailleurs
helped
à
workers
garder
keep
leur
their
emploi
jobs
grâce
through
à
wage
des subventions
subsidies,
salariales, des subventions pour le loyer
rent
et des
subsidies,
prêts pour
and
les
small
PME.
business loans.
Nous avons agi ainsi car
We
c'était
did
la
this
bonne chose
because it
à
was the
faire.
right thing to do.
Nous l'avons également
We
fait
also did it
parce que nous savions
because we
qu'il
knew
s'agissait d'un
it was an
investissement dans
investment
notre
in our
économie
economy
qui
that
serait
would pay
rentable.
off.
Nous avions l'objectif
Our
d'éviter des
goal
dommages
was
à
to
long terme
prevent
sur
economic
notre
scarring.
économie. Nous voulions que notre
We
force
wanted
économique soit
to emerge
intacte
from this
au
with our
lendemain de
economic
la
muscle
pandémie
intact,
pour que nous
ready as a
soyons prêts
country
comme pays à revenir
to
en
come
force.
roaring back.
Il a été coûteux de maintenir l'économie canadienne en vie
Keeping the
pendant que
Canadian
nous entrions
economy
en
on life support
hibernation en
was
réaction
costly
à la
as we went
COVID-19.
into
Nous
hibernation,
savions
but we
toutefois
knew that
que
keeping
le
Canadian
maintien de
families
la solvabilité
and
des familles
businesses
et des
solvent
entreprises canadiennes aiderait
would help
notre
our
économie
economy
à
rebound.
rebondir. This economic and fiscal update provides Canadians with a transparent report of our nation's finances. It also includes targeted investments that will ensure we have the weapons we need to finish the fight against COVID-19, an effort more urgent now than ever with the surge of Omicron. First, we're protecting children with pediatric vaccines, now available for free for all children 5 and over. Booster shots are free for all Canadians too, just as first and second doses have been. Omicron makes boosters more urgently important now than ever. Please go and get your booster as soon as you are eligible. I have booked mine and I'm very glad to have done so. We have enough boosters for everyone, and boosters are an essential defense against the mounting threat of Omicron. We're investing in new antiviral drugs for COVID-19 patients that prevent hospitalizations and will save lives. We're investing in ventilation improvements to prevent outbreaks at schools and workplaces. Jusqu'à présent, notre gouvernement
To
a
date,
fourni
our
près
government
de
has delivered
80
nearly
millions
80
de
million
tests
rapid
rapides
tests
aux
to
provinces, aux
provinces,
territoires et aux
territories,
communautés
and
autochtones,
Indigenous
et
communities,
ce,
and this
gratuitement.
free of charge.
La mise à jour budgétaire réserve
This
un
fiscal
montant
update
de
sets aside a
1,7
further
milliard de dollars,
$1.7 billion,
ce qui est suffisant pour
enough to
pouvoir
procure
fournir 180
180
millions
million
de tests
additional
rapides
rapid tests.
supplémentaires. Ces tests rapides représentent une
These rapid
outil
tests
de plus dans
are an
notre
additional
lutte
tool
contre
in the
le variant
intensifying
Omicron
fight against
qui
Omicron.
s'accentue. Nous les procurons,
We are buying
nous
these tests
les distribuons
and distributing them.
et nous encourageons les
We
Canadiens à les
encourage Canadians
utiliser.
to use them as well.
Nous fournissons aussi un
We are
soutien
also
aux provinces et
providing
aux territoires
support to
pour
provinces and
leur
territories
programme de
for
preuve
proof of
vaccinale.
vaccination credentials.
Alors que nous nous préparons à
And as we
une
brace
nouvelle
ourselves
vague
for the rising
attribuable
wave
au
of
variant
Omicron,
Omicron, nous savons
we
que
know
personne
that
ne
no
veut
one
vivre
wants to
de nouveaux
endure new
confinements.
lockdowns.
C'est pourquoi les vaccins,
This is why vaccines,
l'obligation de se faire vacciner,
vaccine mandates,
les doses de rappel,
boosters,
la ventilation
ventilation,
et les tests
and
rapides
rapid
sont
tests
tellement
are so
importants.
essential.
Au cours des 21
Over
derniers
the
mois,
past 21
nous
months,
avons tous
we
constaté
have all
que des
learned
mesures rapides
that
et locales
fast,
visant
local
à
action
limiter
to
les
limit
éclosions
outbreaks
sont moins
is much less
coûteuses que
costly
le fait d'attendre
than waiting
et d'être
and being
contraint
forced
à
to impose
imposer des restrictions
wider
plus vastes
and
et plus
deeper
sévères.
restrictions.
Grâce à ces connaissances et par
In that
souci
knowledge,
de prudence,
and out of an
nous
abundance of
proposons
caution,
un soutien en
we are
cas de
providing local
confinement
lockdown
local
support
aux travailleurs
for
et
workers
aux
and
entreprises.
businesses.
Ces mesures constituent
These
une
measures
police
are an insurance
d'assurance
policy
pour
for our
notre
country.
pays. Nous les mettons en place
They
pour
are in
aider
place
les
to help
responsables de
local
la
public
santé
health
publique locaux
officials
à faire les
make
bons
the
choix
right
au
decisions
cours des
in the
prochains
coming
mois.
months.
Si des décisions difficiles
Difficult
s'imposent, il
decisions will have
sera
to be
que
made,
leurs communautés
but health
pourront
officials will know that their
obtenir le
communities will be
soutien
able to
dont
obtain
elles ont
the
besoin.
support they need.
Nous ajoutons aussi 10 jours de
We are
congé
also
de
moving forward
maladie
on 10
payés
days of paid
pour
sick leave
les
for
travailleurs
workers
des
in
entreprises
federally
sous
regulated
réglementation
businesses.
fédérale. And we are provisioning an additional $4.5 billion to pay for possible further costs of fighting Omicron and other COVID-19 surges, including spending on border measures and income and business supports. The COVID pandemic triggered the steepest economic contraction in Canada since the Great Depression. At its worst, it cost 3 million Canadians their jobs as our GDP shrank by 17%. This was a once-in-a-generation trauma. When it first hit, many predicted it would take years to rebuild. That's why we are so pleased to report that Canada has largely recovered from the economic damage inflicted by COVID-19 and is poised for robust growth in the months to come. We have now surpassed our target of creating 1 million jobs. In fact, we have recovered 106% of the jobs lost at the peak of the pandemic, significantly outpacing the United States, where just 83% of lost jobs have been recovered so far. From the start, we've understood that few things are more central to the economic well-being of Canadians than having a job. That's why our investments have been so singularly focused on employment and why Canada has experienced the second fastest jobs recovery in the G7. Our GDP has already returned to near pre-pandemic levels. Our GDP growth of 5.4% in the third quarter outpaced the US, the UK, Japan, and Australia. OECD projections suggest that by 2023, Canada's recovery will be the second fastest in the G7. This update shows that the size of the Canadian economy this year will be $2.48 trillion. When we published our economic forecast in the 2018 budget, that is almost exactly the size we expected our economy would have grown to by this year. And we made that forecast when none of us had any idea that our economic growth and our lives would be so deeply disrupted by COVID-19. We are back on track, Mr. Speaker, and that is good news for all Canadians. Canada posted a $25.1 billion surplus in our trade in goods in October as our exports rose. Fewer businesses went bankrupt over the past year than in 2019, before the pandemic. There are now an additional 6,000 active businesses in Canada compared to before the pandemic. Household employment income is now 7% above its pre-crisis level. And Canadians have used this difficult time to pay down their personal debt relative to their income. Our recovery from the COVID-19 recession has significantly surpassed Canada's recovery from the 2008 recession. We have already more than recovered lost jobs, a healing which took 8 months longer after the much milder 2008 recession. We're on track to recover lost GDP 5 months more quickly than after the 2008 contraction. Les bilans des gouvernements provinciaux
Provincial
ont été
government balance sheets
protégés de
were
la
sheltered
pandémie
from the
grâce
pandemic,
à l'appui
thanks to
solide
strong
du
support
gouvernement
from the federal
fédéral.
government.
En fait, les recettes des gouvernements provinciaux et
Provincial
territoriaux
and territorial
ont
government
augmenté
revenues
en
actually
2020-2021
increased in 2020-2021.
en
Why?
raison d'un soutien
Thanks to
fédéral
substantial
important
federal support,
par l'intermédiaire
both
de
through
transferts
direct transfers
directs et
and through
l'intervention du
Canada's
Canada pour répondre
COVID-19
à la
economic
COVID-19.
response.
Ces aides ont permis de
This
fixer
assistance
une plancher
helped to set a
aux
floor
recettes des
under
gouvernements provinciaux
provincial
et
and
territoriaux
territorial government
et de
revenues,
limiter ainsi leur
thus
déficit
limiting their
et
deficits
leur dette.
and debt.
Le gouvernement fédéral a fourni 8
8
dollars
out of every
sur
$10
chaque tranche de
provided
10
to
dollars
fight
dépensés
COVID-19
au
and
Canada
support
pour
Canadians
combattre
throughout the
la
pandemic
COVID-19 et
came
soutenir les
from the federal
Canadiens
government.
tout au long de la pandémie. Notre
Our
gouvernement
government
continuera
will
de faire
continue
preuve de
to
souplesse
be agile
malgré la grande
despite the great
volatilité
volatility
et les nouveaux
and new
développements dans les
developments
secteurs
in
de la
health
santé
sectors
et de
and
l'économie
in
à
the global
l'échelle mondiale.
economy.
Nous devons continuer
We must
la
continue
propagation.
to manage the spread.
Excusez-moi. Nous devons continuer
We must continue
contrôler
to manage
la
the spread
propagation de ce
of
virus
this
sournois
sneaky
et
and
imprévisible.
unpredictable virus.
La douleur des familles qui ont
The pain
perdu
of families who
un
lost a
être
loved
cher
one
ne pourra
can
jamais
never
être mesuré.
be measured.
Comme principe directeur, nous
Our guiding
continuerons
principle
d'avoir
will
la
continue to
conviction
be the
que
conviction
la meilleure
that the best
politique
economic
économique
policy
est une politique
is a
forte
strong
en matière
health
de santé.
policy.
Parce que sauver des vies a toujours
Because saving
été notre priorité,
lives has always been our
nous avons
priority.
pu
We were able
obtenir
to achieve
d'excellents
excellent
résultats
economic
économiques
performances
et nous avons le deuxième
and the
taux de
second lowest
mortalité
mortality
le
rate
plus
in
bas
the
des
G7.
pays du G7. Alors que nous nous tournons vers le
As
futur,
we look ahead,
nous sommes conscients de l'inflation
we are
élevée
mindful
et
of
son
elevated
impact
inflation
sur le coût de
and
la
its
vie
impact
pour
on the
les
cost of
Canadiens
living for
et Canadiennes.
Canadians.
Nous savons que
We
l'inflation
know that
est un phénomène
inflation is a global
mondial
phenomenon
qui découle de défis
driven by
sans
the
précédent
unprecedented
que
challenge
représente la
of
réouverture de
reopening the
l'économie
world's
mondiale.
economy,
Il est beaucoup plus compliqué de redémarrer
turning
l'économie
the world
mondiale
economy
que
back
de
on
l'arrêter.
is a great deal more
Pendant les
complicated
confinements,
than turning
les
it off.
revenus des Canadiens
During
sont demeurés
lockdowns,
élevés
Canadians'
en
incomes
moyenne,
remain strong
mais
on
les
average,
possibilités de
but
dépenser en
opportunities to
services
spend
ont
on
été
services
fortement
were
limitées. Le
were
résultat
severely
est que
restricted.
les Canadiens ont
The result
dépensé
was that
plus
Canadians
d'argent dans
spent
les
more
biens durables,
on durable goods.
sans les repas dans les restaurants, les
Without
soins
meals in
personnels
restaurants,
ou les
personal
vacances.
care,
Les Canadiens ont
or
utilisé
vacations,
le revenu
Canadians spent
disponible
their
pour
disposable income
effectuer des
on
rénovations,
renovations,
acheter de nouveaux meubles
new
et
furniture,
appareils électroménagers,
appliances,
ainsi
and
que les
cars.
voitures. Il faudra du temps
It will
pour
take some
que les
time
chaînes
for supply
d'approvisionnement
chains to catch up
rattrapent le retard et pour
and
que
for our
notre
economy
économie
to
se
rebalance itself.
rééquilibre. Afin d'alléger la
To
pression
alleviate
sur
pressure
les
on
chaînes
Canada's supply
d'approvisionnement du Canada,
chains,
nous annonçons aujourd'hui
today we are
un montant
announcing
de
$50 million
50 millions de dollars dans le
to
cadre d'un
launch a
appel
call for
de proposition.
proposals.
Celui-ci aidera les
This will
ports
help Canadian
canadiens
ports
à acquérir une
acquire cargo
capacité
storage capacity
d'entreposage du fret et pour
and
mettre
take
en
other
place
measures
d'autres mesures
to
qui
relieve supply
diminueront la
chain
pression sur
congestion.
les chaînes d'approvisionnement. Our government understands that a strong monetary policy framework is the best weapon in our arsenal to keep prices stable so that Canadians can afford the cost of living. That's why yesterday we renewed the Bank of Canada's 2% inflation target to ensure that the current rate of inflation does not become entrenched. Canada was a pioneer when we established an inflation target to guide our central bank in setting interest rates. In the 30 years since, the Bank of Canada has successfully maintained price stability in our country. Our government has every confidence the bank will continue to deliver on this essential mandate. Canadians should be wholly confident in their central bank. Beaucoup de Canadiens s'inquiètent de joindre les deux bouts.
Many Canadians
C'est
worry
pourquoi nous
about
sommes
making
heureux
ends meet.
d'avoir
That is
indexé à
why we're
l'inflation
glad
l'allocation
to have
canadienne pour
indexed the
enfants,
Canada Child
la
Benefit to
sécurité de la
inflation,
vieillesse, le
as well
supplément
as
de revenu
indexing to
garanti,
inflation the
le
old age
crédit pour la
security,
taxe
the
sur les
guaranteed
produits
income
et les
supplement, the goods
services
and
et
services
d'autres
tax credit,
prestations
and
pour les
other
personnes les
benefits
plus
for the most
vulnérables.
vulnerable.
Nous nous engageons aujourd'hui
Today,
à
we
verser
are
aux
committing to
bénéficiaires canadiens
provide
du supplément
to
de revenu
beneficiaries of
garanti
the guaranteed
ou de
income supplement
l'allocation
or
un montant
allowance
unique
a
afin
one-time payment.
d'atténuer les difficultés
This will help
financières
alleviate the
vécues
financial
en
hardship
raison
that they
des
may have
effets
faced as a
inattendus
result
de
of
la
unintended
perception d'une
consequences
nouvelle
of receiving a
prestation.
second benefit.
En outre, nous établissons
We
un
are
plan
also
afin
laying out a plan
d'accorder
to
un
provide
allègement
debt
de la
relief
dette aux
to
étudiants
students
qui doivent rembourser
who
la
need to
prestation
repay the
canadienne
Canada
d'urgence
Emergency
qu'ils ont
Response
touchée
benefits
sans
that they
y
were
avoir
not
droit.
eligible for.
Nous proposons que le montant dû
We
par
propose
l'étudiant
to offset
concerné
their debt
soit compensé
with the
par la
Canada
somme à
Emergency
laquelle
Student Benefit
ils avaient
amount
droit au
for
titre
which
de
they were
la
eligible.
prestation canadienne d'urgence pour étudiantes. Nous mettons en place le Fonds de résilience
We
des
are
travailleurs
also
des arts
proposing
de
to
la scène du
establish the
Canada,
$60
doté
million
de 60 millions
Canada
de dollars.
Performing Arts
Ce
Workers
fonds
Resilience
soutiendra
Fund.
des initiatives
This
qui
fund will
améliorent la
support
situation
new
économique, la
or
carrière et les
enhanced
conditions de travail
initiatives
des
that
travailleurs des
improve the
arts de la scène,
financial and
incluant
career
les
and
travailleurs
working conditions
indépendants.
of performance art
Early
workers,
learning and childcare
including
costs
independent
are like a
contractors.
second mortgage for many young Canadian families. And childcare, which is too expensive or just not available, keeps many mothers from going back to work. An unacceptable break on our economy at a time when we are facing labor force shortages. We knew that high quality $10 a day childcare would make life more affordable for Canadian families and drive economic growth. That's why our $30 billion investment in early learning and childcare was the cornerstone of the April budget. Our plan was widely supported, but many Canadians were skeptical about our ability to get the job done. I understood them. After all, Canadian women had been trying to establish a national system of early learning and childcare for more than half a century. And, à l'exception du Québec, we had not succeeded. Well, today I have great news for Canada's working mothers and fathers. Less than 8 months after we announced our bold project in our budget, we now have childcare deals with 9 provinces and 1 territory. Within 5 years, Canadians will proudly rely on $10 a day childcare, just as our universal, publicly accessible healthcare system has come to define us as a society. This is a historic accomplishment which will transform the life of every parent in Canada and of every future parent in Canada for generations to come. So let's give this effort a final push and conclude agreements with Ontario, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. We can and we must get this done now. Immigration is another important driver of economic growth and a Canadian competitive advantage. Our government is committed to bringing in 411,000 immigrants in 2022, the highest number in Canadian history. To help support this effort and reduce processing time for permanent and temporary resident and Canadian citizenship applications, we are investing $85 million in our immigration system. Housing prices are a real concern, especially for middle-class Canadians hoping to buy their first home. Housing affordability remains a priority for our government, and we will take further action in the upcoming budget. As we announced in the spring budget, on January 1st, 2022, our government will apply Canada's first national tax on vacant property owned by non-resident, non-Canadians. As we said we would, The government is also bringing forward legislation to extend the Northern Residence Deduction so Canadians in the North can claim up to $1,200 in eligible travel expenses on their taxes starting next month. The government will also bring forward legislation to extend small businesses' deadline for the repayment of Canada Emergency Business Account loans and ensure that seasonal workers who received pandemic benefits can still qualify for the EI Seasonal Workers Pilot Project. Les changements climatiques sont également à l'origine d'une
Climate
volatilité
change is
accrue
also
de
contributing
l'économie.
to causing
Les
increased
récentes
volatility in the economy.
inondations tragiques en
The
Colombie-Britannique
recent floods
ont
in British
dévasté
Columbia,
des maisons,
which were
des fermes
tragic,
et des
devastated
infrastructures
homes,
essentielles
farms, and
et
critical
ralenti les
infrastructure.
chaînes d'approvisionnement.
It also
De
further
graves
disrupted supply
sécheresses, y
chains.
compris dans les
Severe
prairies,
droughts,
ont
including
contribué à
across the prairies,
l'augmentation du prix des
contributed
aliments.
to driving
Nous
up food
prenons des
prices.
mesures pour
We
lutter
are taking
contre les
action
changements
to
climatiques.
fight climate
Le
change.
Canada est un chef de
Canada
file avec
is
son
a
prix
world
sur la
leader
pollution,
with
ce
its
qui
price on
contribue à
pollution.
réduire les émissions et à
Our price
construire
on
une
pollution
économie
is
plus
contributing to
propre.
lowering emissions
En
and
fait,
building a cleaner
lorsque de
economy.
nombreux pays du monde
In fact,
cherchent à être plus
many
ambitieux,
countries are now
ils
seeking to
s'inspirent
be
de
more
notre plan.
ambitious
Nous travaillons
and are taking
également à
inspiration
finaliser
from
la
our
première
plan.
stratégie
We are also
nationale
working to
d'adaptation
finalize
du
Canada's
Canada
first
d'ici
national
la fin
adaptation
de l'année
strategy
prochaine.
by the end of
La
next year.
transition verte de l'économie mondiale
The green
est en cours.
transition of the global
Cette
economy
transition
is underway.
nous amène de nouvelles
This transition
perspectives économiques
gives us new
tout en
economic
posant des défis
opportunities
importants.
as well as
Notre
some major
gouvernement est
challenges.
déterminé à
Our
ce que
government
les
is
Canadiens
determined
sortent
to ensure that
encore plus
Canadians emerge
prospères
from
de
this
cette
international
transformation
transformation
internationale
even more
qu'ils ne le
prosperous
sont
than we are
aujourd'hui.
today.
Ce permettra aux Canadiens de
This will
partout au
ensure that
pays
there are good,
d'avoir de bons
sustainable
emplois
jobs for
durables
Canadians in
pour
every
les
corner of the
décennies à
country
venir.
for decades to come.
Above all, we know that our national focus, once we emerge from COVID-19, must be growth and competitiveness. Measures to promote them will figure prominently in the budget. Our government understood from the start of this pandemic that the best way to maintain strong public finances was by keeping our economy strong. That's what our emergency spending achieved. This fall, Moody's and S&P both reaffirmed Canada's AAA credit rating. We know that Canadians work hard to earn a living and expect us to be careful with their money. We know we have a duty to do the right thing for today and for tomorrow. We understand that our debts must be repaid. We came into this crisis with the lowest net debt to GDP ratio in the G7, and in fact, we have increased our relative advantage during the pandemic. We remain committed to the fiscal anchors that we outlined in the spring budget to reduce the federal debt to GDP ratio over the medium term and to unwind COVID-19 related deficits. In October, we pivoted from necessary but costly broad-based support programs to more narrowly targeted, less expensive measures, as we had promised we would do. Our government will continue to be a responsible and prudent fiscal manager. This update reports a deficit of $327.7 billion for the last fiscal year and of $144.5 billion for this fiscal year. This compares favorably to our forecast of $354.2 billion and $154.7 billion, respectively, in the April budget. Our debt to GDP ratio in the last fiscal year was 47.5%. It will peak at 48% in this fiscal year and then fall steadily, as will the deficit. This contrasts positively with our prediction in the April budget. In budget 2021, we forecast that in this fiscal year, 42% of our bond issuance would be long-term debt of 10 years or more. Today, we can forecast that it will be 45%. And recall, in 2019, only 15% of our debt was locked in over a long-term horizon. Pushing more of our debt into bonds with a longer maturity ensures that Canada's debt servicing costs are sustainable. Thanks to an improving fiscal outlook, the amount of money we will need to issue in borrowings this year is $35 billion lower than forecast in budget 2021. Despite a necessary and unprecedented level of spending to support Canadians during COVID-19, our public debt charges as a share of GDP will be the same this year and next year as they were in 2018, 2019, before the pandemic. This fiscal update includes a provision to settle the cases on harm to First Nation children currently before the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, and to invest in transforming the services offered to First Nation children and their families. We have provisioned $20 billion for compensation and $20 billion to improve the system going forward. The Government of Canada is working towards an agreement with the parties on this issue. We know that paying our historic debt to Indigenous peoples is paramount, and that we must act to ensure that these injustices do not happen again. We will not, and we cannot evade this essential commitment. That is why we are today setting aside the funds to pay for it. It has been a hard 21 months, but we are succeeding because we are doing what Canadians do in a crisis. We are helping each other, we are working together, and we are doing what needs to be done, whether it is as big as the wage subsidies or as small as wearing a mask at the grocery store. With winter upon us and Omicron now among us, we know that there will still be tempests ahead. But we are resilient. Our plan is working. And once we finish the fight against COVID-19, we will turn our resolve towards fighting climate change, advancing reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and building an economy that is stronger, fairer, more competitive, and more prosperous for all Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question come out there. The honourable member for Carleton.
Thank you very much, and I thank the minister.
Is that a point of order? Or?
It was, Mr. Speaker. I'm sorry for the
I'm sorry to interrupt, and I'll let the honourable member for Sherwood Park,
simply rising on a point of order, Mr. Speaker, to say it has long been the practice of this House that when an update is given of this nature, that copies are distributed of the documents that are being debated. And I understand today I'm quite frustrated by the fact that the government has not supplied nearly enough copies of the document for members of Parliament to be able to look at those documents while the minister is speaking. And I ask you to come back to the House and rule on whether or not this is appropriate. This is a critical issue. Members should have access to those documents right in front of them in paper form. This has long been the practice of the House. I'm not sure why the government isn't respecting this practice.
Okay, actually, the question, excuse me, the Honourable Member for Carleton, I just want to answer this. The question was asked during the speech, and we did look around. There weren't enough hard copies provided to the opposition lobby to be passed around. But my understanding is there is an electronic copy coming your way shortly. Unfortunately, I don't have any control over that. That is something that the government provides. The honourable member, or we'll go to questions and comments. The honourable member for Carleton.
Thank you very much. I guess with all the money printing deficits, they didn't have enough paper left to print these documents, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Minister of Inflation for her presentation today. It reveals that inflation is in fact 50% higher than she promised in the budget. Wow. And the deflation that she said we'd have a year ago has definitely not materialized. $500 billion of inflationary deficits mean more dollars chasing fewer goods and higher prices. The result, of course, is that housing and gas is up by a third, making it hard for people to get to work or house themselves. Food prices will rise $1,000 for the average family next year, and not to mention that taxes cost the average family more than food, clothing, and shelter combined. The more this government spends, the more Canadians pay. And to add insult to injury, we learned today that the government is collecting a windfall of tax revenue as they get higher taxes on higher prices. It's called the inflation tax, or as liberals would say, just inflation. So my question is a very specific one. How much in extra tax revenue will the government collect as a result of higher than expected inflation on the backs of Canadian consumers?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister.
Mr. Speaker, that question actually was a very general and meandering one. So I'm going to offer a general and specific answer. And let me say this. Yes, the government did undertake extraordinary spending.
Second, I'm going to interrupt the Honourable Minister. Is there a problem with... No, I'm sorry. Somebody was signaling that their earpiece wasn't working. I believe it's working now. Okay. I'm sorry to interrupt. Please continue, Madam Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So let me be very clear. Yes, the government did undertake extraordinary spending to support Canadians during the fight against COVID-19. And Mr. Speaker, in this fiscal update, we are making provision for further spending in that fight. We are spending on therapeutics. We are spending on rapid tests. We are spending on boosters. And we are making a $4.5 billion provision to account for potential additional costs imposed by Omicron. Mr. Speaker, I am absolutely confident that the vast majority of Canadians understand that this spending is not only necessary, it is essential to protect health and also to protect our economy. And Mr. Speaker, the results speak for themselves. Our economy has already more than recovered all the jobs we lost to the COVID recession. GDP is nearly at pre-pandemic levels, and this is a better performance than most of our peer countries around the world.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? L'honorable député d'Avignon, la Métis Matane, Matapédia.
The Honourable Member for Avignon, la Métis Matane, Matapédia. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister for her speech. I have a question for her. Quebec and the provinces have unanimously asked over several months that an immediate payment be made for health transfers with 6% indexing. Therefore, I want to know why she intends to keep the transfers indexation rate at 3%, which will not keep up with health costs until 2027.
Merci pour la question. Et je pense, annonce souligne le niveau auquel le fédéral
This announcement underscores how much the federal government is there for Canadians, as well as the provinces and territories, including when it comes to health care. We bought vaccines, we purchased booster doses,
comme j'ai souligné dans l'annonce, Monsieur le Président,
and as I underscored in the statement,
de chaque $10 dépensés par les gouvernements à tous les niveaux du Canada sont dépensés par le fédéral. Le fédéral est là pour les Canadiens et Canadiennes. Le fédéral est là pour les Québécois et les Québécoises dans la matière de la santé, et le fédéral est là pour appuyer les entreprises et les gens. Nous ferons notre juste part.
We will do our fair share.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Alongside low-income advocacy groups, seniors advocacy groups, and affected seniors themselves, the NDP has been pushing for months now for action on the GIS clawback. We see some indication now of the approach that the government intends to take, but it does raise some questions. The solution we were advocating for was to not count pandemic benefits in the eligibility calculation for the guaranteed income supplement. The Parliamentary Budget Officer said that would affect about 88,000 seniors. It would cost about $434 million. The government is instead proposing a program they say will affect about 200,000 people at a cost of about $742 million, and that it'll be a one-time payment. It's unclear if seniors will be back paid for the income that they lost. It's unclear if their monthly payments will be restored so that they continue to have the monthly income they need to pay rent over the next number of years, or whether they're just going to be receiving a check. So if the minister could provide some clarity to these seniors, who some of whom have lost their home and have been waiting for an announcement on what their life is going to look like going into the future, how are they going to determine how much is paid to each individual senior? How are they going to roll out the funds? When is it going to happen? And how is it going to help ensure that they have the money they need to get back in an apartment and pay rent for the next 12 months instead of just getting a one-time thank you very much, sorry for the inconvenience from the government?
Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member opposite for that important question. Our government does agree, and I think all Canadians would agree, that seniors have been so hard hit by the pandemic, and that seniors who qualify for the GRS are among the most vulnerable people in Canada, and we have to support them. That's why I'm really glad that in this update, I was able to confirm that we will compensate those seniors who have had their GIS clawed back because they received the CERB. And so the most important thing I want to do today is to reassure all of those seniors who I'm sure are really worried about paying their bills, that is going to be fixed and they will be compensated for that clawback. We're going to ensure that the compensation meets the amount of clawback for all the seniors who were affected by this.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for the fiscal update today. My question to her is along the lines of where this government has been over the last number of years in terms of being there to properly support Canadians. We know that the government has been there every step of the way, and with the onset of Omicron and the potential of what outbreaks could mean in our country, what is the message that we want to give to Canadians right now in terms of properly ensuring that they have the resources to protect themselves and to get through and to finish the fight against COVID? We know that employment, despite the fact that it initially went down, has bounced right back up. And we want to know, Mr. Speaker, from the Minister, if she can provide some direction and some comment to Canadians about what they can expect in the weeks and months to come.
Great question.
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I would like to thank the member for Kingston and the Islands for that really important question. I have three messages for Canadians today. The first is a bit of a tough one, and that is that COVID is still with us, that the Omicron variant is serious, and we need to take it seriously. That's not a message anyone wants to hear as we head into the holidays. And I know how hard it is for us to really accept that, but it's the reality. And I think one thing we have all learned from this virus, and I think, by the way, it's the way Canadians tend to behave anyway, is better to do the right thing now and to take action now and to avoid something more serious in the future. So message one is be careful. Message two is the government is supporting Canadians with all the tools we need, the healthcare tools and the economic support. Message three is we've been doing a great job. Our economy has largely recovered from the COVID recession. Let's keep on going. We're almost there.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance has proven her government has no economic plan for our country. That's how I started my response to last year's economic update. And unfortunately, the exact same thing rings true today. Today, the Liberal government shared a snapshot of Canada's economic position. The minister is actually hoping to fool Canadians into thinking that everything is fine. After shutting down an economy for over a year and spending $500 billion, Mr. Speaker, of course you will see some growth and some employment gains. But what they neglected to point out is how their mismanagement has led our country and Canadian families to the edge of an economic cliff, Mr. Speaker. Inflation, in fact, is helping fudge the Liberal numbers while hurting families and seniors across this great country. Just inflation, good for his budget, bad for your budget, Mr. Speaker. Canadians are living through a cost of living crisis. We hear that all across the country, Mr. Speaker. They're living through an inflation crisis that this finance minister predicted a year ago would be deflation, Mr. Speaker. Wrong on all the fundamental projections upon which cost of living is based. Canadians, new families, seniors are struggling with a housing crisis across this country, Mr. Speaker. And the Liberal government is now focused on making life more expensive for Canadians. They plan on taxing the sale of homes, including your home, Mr. Speaker. And on January 1st, they're going to start raising taxes. Mr. Speaker, while the Liberals have no plan for our recovery, they certainly have a high tax, high debt agenda. And that is the last thing Canadians can afford right now. During my response to the speech from the throne last month, I spoke about Peter from Nova Scotia, who owns a boat charter and lobster eatery in Peggy's Cove. Small businesses like his are struggling with rising costs. They're struggling to make ends meet, and they're going to be struggling to pay this government's new payroll tax. I spoke about Clifford from rural Alberta, Mr. Speaker, who's felt completely left behind by the Liberal government. Clifford is a senior on fixed income, and he's struggling with rising prices. Gas is up, food is up, home heating is up. Everything is going up except his benefits, Mr. Speaker. Does this Prime Minister, does the Liberal Finance Minister know about the real struggles these Canadians are facing? Are they listening? Sadly, Canadians like Peter, like Clifford, like millions of Canadians across this country are being left behind by a government that is continually out of touch. That's why the Conservative opposition will be here to be a voice for the millions of Canadians being left behind in the Liberal economy. Les Canadiens sont en difficulté de plus en plus,
Canadians
Monsieur
are
le Président.
increasingly struggling,
Leurs
Mr.
chèques de
Speaker.
paie ne suivent pas la hausse du coût de la vie.
Their paychecks
Les
can't keep
salaires
up with the
moyens
increased cost
augmentent
of living.
de près de 2%.
Average
Mais
wages
pendant
have
ce temps,
increased by about
l'inflation
2%.
augmente de près
Meanwhile,
de
inflation has
5%.
increased by nearly 5%.
Ça veut dire qu'une famille moyenne
That
a
means
subi
that the
une
average
baisse de
family
salaire de
has seen their
3%
pay go down by
uniquement
3%
cette année.
just this year.
Canadians are getting priced out of their own lives, Mr. Speaker. Merry Christmas from the Liberal government. To cope with rising home prices and stagnant wages, Canadians have been piling on more and more personal debt in recent years. And now many Canadian families have their finances close to a breaking point. Is this government listening? 27% of Canadians say they're insolvent and can't pay all monthly bills and debt payments as costs are going up. Half of Canadians say that they're $200 or less away from financial insolvency each month. Canadian household budgets are fragile. And when you see increases in 20 to 30% for gas, for fuel, for rent, or food, that crisis is out of control, Mr. Speaker. And 35% of Canadians are concerned that future interest rate increases could drive them towards financial bankruptcy. And the Bank of Canada recently said that interest rates will go up next year, Mr. Speaker. Some experts expect rates to be increased 5 times or more next year. In the Globe and Mail today, the head of the CD Howe, Mr. Speaker, had a column warning on this called Brace for Impact, Mr. Speaker. He said that investors, quote, investors, homeowners, businesses, and big borrowing governments need to get ready. Interest rate increases are coming. This at a time when this government is starting the new year by raising taxes on Canadians on January 1st, Mr. Speaker. Happy New Year. Mr. Speaker, this is why inflation matters. This is why monetary policy matters. This is why the budget, job creation, our competitiveness, trade with the United States, it's why our economic future matters, Mr. Speaker. By 2023, this Prime Minister will have doubled the national debt, spending more than all previous Prime Ministers combined. That is astounding, Mr. Speaker. And hardly even a notice from a Prime Minister who thinks that budgets balance themselves and might think that Canadians' credit card bills do the same, Mr. Speaker.
Remember that?
That is not the case. We have a government coming out of COVID that spent more per capita than all our allies, Mr. Speaker, and have some of the worst results. So in today's fall economic statement, cleverly snuck in just before the Christmas break, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance bragged about how Canada's deficit numbers are better than expected. But let's take a look at that, Mr. Speaker. We know the Minister of Finance has already been flagged for misleading video on Twitter. Maybe we should look at the numbers behind her claims. Because, in fact, inflation is boosting their tax revenues, Mr. Speaker. If you raise the general price level by almost 5%, that boosts GST revenues by 5%, Mr. Speaker. Our deficit numbers are smaller because their inflation is higher. And when the Shadow Minister for Finance asks a simple question of the Minister of Finance on this issue, how much more revenue they've collected from driving up inflation, she wouldn't answer the question, Mr. Speaker. Canadians are paying the price. Inflation may look good to pad their budget, as it makes it impossible for Canadians to meet their budget. Inflation is rising by almost 5%, the highest in 18 years. And the Bank of Canada is warning that will get even higher in the months ahead and stay that way through parts of next year. So, Mr. Speaker, for families with tight budgets, families of seniors on fixed income. These are alarming numbers, Mr. Speaker. Our country is drowning in the rising waters of debt that is being fueled by inflation and by ideological policies that are driving away investment and making Canada one of the last places people will come for their economic recovery. And now we're watching the consequences of this government's decisions in real time. Heating your home as we head into the Christmas holidays, more expensive. Natural gas prices up nearly 20%. Filling up your car to go visit grandparents on Christmas Eve. Gas up almost 42%. And even the cost of that big breakfast on Christmas morning, Mr. Speaker. Eggs up 7.4%, juice up 5%, jam up 8%, and bacon up 20%, Mr. Speaker. Almost losing our appetite with the rising inflation, Mr. Speaker. But their lack of action on competitiveness and supporting Canadian workers is the real canary in the coal mine for our economy, Mr. Speaker. Canada is bleeding capital investment. More investment and production is going to the United States and to overseas. This means we're becoming even more dependent on foreign countries and on foreign supply chains that are not choosing to get supply to Canada, but to themselves. This is a government that its only record achievement beyond debt is record failure in negotiations with the United States. They've failed energy workers. They've failed forestry workers. They've failed farming families. They have failed auto workers. And with Buy American, Mr. Speaker, they're failing every supply chain in manufacturing, including steel and aluminum, across this great country, failing millions of Canadians. No wonder President Biden said Canada, under this Prime Minister, is his easiest relation. It's easy to win for the U.S. under this government, Mr. Speaker. Monsieur le Président, les entreprises manquent cruellement d'employés. Tout le monde le voit, sauf les libéraux. Ma question au Premier ministre, avez-vous un plan et des solutions concrètes pour mettre fin au problème de la pénurie de main-d'œuvre? Je devrais dire à cette crise. Mais comme toujours, le Premier ministre fait la sourde oreille. C'est le temps que le gouvernement libéral s'attaque à la pénurie de main-d'œuvre qui touche tout le Québec et tout le Canada. C'est pourquoi il doit faciliter l'entrée des travailleurs immigrants, investir dans les programmes de formation spécialisés et encourager les gens à faire carrière dans les métiers. Il doit également offrir des incitatifs aux employeurs, mais aussi aux employés pour retourner au travail. Ça va encourager les gens à retourner travailler, Monsieur le Président. Les temps pressent. Les entrepreneurs sont à bout de patience, tout comme nous. Business investment declined by an average of 1% every year from 2016 to 2019, reaching a 25-year low as a percentage of GDP. And that was just before the pandemic, Mr. Speaker. Canadian factories are operating with the lowest levels of capital investment in 35 years, which will lead to lower productivity, fewer jobs, and lower wages. Businesses across Canada, but particularly in Southern Ontario, are investing and creating jobs, but in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, Mr. Speaker, they're going to a more competitive, less regulatory burdensome environment where they don't see payroll taxes going up the first of the new year, where they see incentive and opportunity as opposed to ideological being held back, Mr. Speaker. The saddest part is we're losing opportunity to build the future economy, Mr. Speaker. Canada should be booming, firing on all cylinders, investing in new technologies, innovating, and providing upward pressure on wages because of that growth. We can get back to building prosperity and great jobs for Canadians, but the Liberal government, and it's clear today, has no plan to make that a reality. Conservatives, Mr. Speaker, believe in a Canada where everyone has the chance to work hard. Everyone has the chance to own a home. Everyone has a chance to build this country up and give it to their children for success in the future. But half of Canadians under 30 are giving up on owning a home. That is a failure of leadership of epic proportions, Mr. Speaker. Nationwide, the average price of a home has jumped by $54,000 just in the last few months, Mr. Speaker, up 30%. And worse, according to RE/MAX last week, real estate prices are expected to surge another 9.2% next year. Do we really want to be the country, Mr. Speaker, where young people, a generation of them, are giving up on the idea of owning a home? Do we really want to be increasingly a nation of part-time, of contract, of not long-term jobs with growth potential for all Canadians? This government is giving up on the next generation of Canadians. And for those that already own their home, Mr. Speaker, they're going to tax the sale of it, Mr. Speaker. They're slowly coming after your home equity under the guise of a solution to the housing crisis they presided over the last 5 to 6 years, Mr. Speaker. Cette taxe cible les Canadiens qui travaillent fort et qui veulent profiter de la vente de leur maison pour financer leur retraite. C'est simple.
It's simple.
Cette taxe enlève leur économie si durement gagnée. Mr. Speaker, their solutions will only make the housing crisis work and attack people as they approach retirement. Conservatives have pressed for concrete actions to address our housing crisis, to build more homes, Mr. Speaker, and to return the dream of home ownership to millions of Canadians. Unlike the Liberal government, we are not giving up on Canadians under 30, Mr. Speaker. What we see in another hollow economic statement released on the eve of a Christmas break is empty promises, massive debt, higher taxes, and no real economic plan. The Finance Minister is not telling Canadians the real story, Mr. Speaker. Inflation is hurting Canadian families, but helping the Liberal finances, Mr. Speaker. Conservatives on this side of the House will continue to be a voice for the millions of Canadians being left behind by the Liberal government. We're going to fight to build more housing, to tackle the cost of living crisis, to hold this government to account for giving up on the next generation. And we're going to build a plan to restore Canadian prosperity and to make Canada an economic powerhouse. Right now, Canada should be focused on proposing solutions to lift up Canadian families with great jobs and rising wages. We need to build a dynamic economy that benefits people in all sectors of our economy and in all regions of the country. From the resources in the ground, Mr. Speaker, to the ideas in our heads, we need Canada to build, discover, and strive. We need a generation of Canadians that want to win and not settle for second, third, or 10th best. C'est le temps de simplifier le régime fiscal. C'est le temps de réduire les formalités bureaucratiques. C'est le temps de faire du Canada le meilleur endroit au monde où investir, créer, développer, construire et ou démarrer une entreprise. Nous allons faire du Canada un pays avec l'économie la plus innovatrice au monde. Un pays avec des taux d'imposition ultra concurrentiels. Un pays avec les incitatifs
a country with incentives for innovation, an advanced research agency focused on the private sector and the economy of the future.
Let's provide financing and investment capital to small businesses so they can flourish, Mr. Speaker. Let's build world-class infrastructure all across this great country, not fund more bureaucratic programs. Let's also be proud, Mr. Speaker, of our resource sector and the millions of direct and indirect jobs from it. It is the only thing really driving our current account balance, Mr. Speaker, and this Prime Minister and his ideological ministers want to end it. Our energy is the most ethical, our critical minerals are the most accessible, and our commitment to emission reduction and Indigenous participation is the most reliable in the world. It's time for a new approach, not more empty words and failed promises. It's time to create a dynamic and more prosperous Canada, one that grows, that strives, that wins. It's time to stop being happy with last place. It's the time to stop being happy with record debt, higher taxes, and more government intervention, Mr. Speaker. Canada's Conservatives are here to build. We're here to hold up. We're here to win, and we're here to fight for our children's future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the worldwide pandemic hit Canada, the Prime Minister and this government stepped up and made it very clear that we were going to be there for Canadians. And over the days and weeks and months that followed, programs flowed to support Canadians in a very real and tangible way. Whether it was wage subsidy programs, whether it was a CERB program, whether it was direct payments to seniors, whether it was direct payments to people with disabilities, we were there. The Conservatives, depending on which member is speaking, will talk about the deficit, trying to imply that we spent too much. Madam Speaker, we were there to support Canadians. We now have Bill C-2 before us. It's a continuation of supporting Canadians. Will the leader of the Conservative Party and the Conservatives ensure that ongoing support for Canadian workers and businesses and Canadians in general be there by supporting Bill C-2 and ensuring that it passes before Christmas?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians that might watch the debates in Parliament know that there's another inflation in the last few months in this Parliament. It's the inflated word count by that member, the Deputy House Leader. The inflated amount of outrage, Mr. Speaker, manufactured fiddling while our economy burns. Let's talk about stepped up at the beginning of this crisis. Mr. Speaker, it was the Conservatives that asked for the border to be controlled when the pandemic first broke, 2 months before this government asked. It was myself, Mr. Speaker, that 2 months before the government asked said the EI system and the military had to be stood up to help our healthcare sisters. It was the opposition that said a 10% wage subsidy won't save a single job, Mr. Speaker. It was our Shadow Minister of Finance that said let's save as many jobs as possible and not have people not work, Mr. Speaker. We will always put the health and well-being of Canadians first. But right now, the cost of living crisis, the housing crisis, the inflationary crisis facing our country hardly warrants a mention by this finance minister. I would ask that honourable member to raise his voice tomorrow in caucus. Stop neglecting Canadian families and the cost of living crisis they're facing.
Questions et commentaires. Questions and comments. L'honorable député de Rivière-du-Nord.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, c'est incroyable, cette affaire-là. Pendant qu'au Québec, là, on a des problèmes avec les soins de santé, les provinces, le Québec, tout le monde à l'unanimité demande 28 milliards d'un seul versement, puis indexation de 6 jusqu'à ce qu'on atteigne le 35 Il n'y a rien là-dessus. La ministre nous dit tantôt, we will work to help. Elle ne travaille pas pour aider partout. Les personnes âgées, même chose, Monsieur le Président. Les personnes âgées payent 7 de plus pour leur panier d'épicerie. Qu'est-ce qu'ils ont du fédéral? Un chèque unique. On demande, c'est unanime ça, à travers le Québec et les provinces, on demande une augmentation récurrente des pensions. On demande au Bloc québécois 110 $ par mois d'augmentation récurrente. Mais non, le gouvernement fédéral a divisé les aînés de 65 à 75, 75 et plus. Et là, encore une fois, aucune augmentation récurrente, Monsieur le Président. Le gouvernement semble épuisé. Il y a la pénurie de main-d'œuvre qu'il faut combattre. Il n'y a rien, il n'y a pas de mesure pour aider ça. Moi, sur ma rue, sur un petit bout de rue dans ma circonscription, 4 restaurants sont fermés. Un magasin de vêtements qui est fermé, Monsieur le Président. Il y a des gens malades. On avait le projet de loi d'Émilie sans façon là, pour aider les malades là, qui reçoivent 15 semaines d'assurance chômage. Tu combats un cancer, tu reçois 15 semaines d'assurance chômage. Alors que tout le monde en reçoit 52. C'est tous des problèmes criants, Monsieur le Président. Je ne sais pas ce que mon collègue, le chef d'opposition officiel en pense, mais en ce qui me concerne, cette déclaration-là d'aujourd'hui, ça rate complètement la cible, Monsieur le Président. Les besoins ne sont pas comblés et c'est incroyable de voir à quel point ce gouvernement-là est épuisé alors qu'il vient tout juste d'être élu, Monsieur le Président.
L'honorable chef de l'opposition.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Les conservateurs, nous sommes ici pour tous les Canadiens, tous les Québécois. Et c'était une erreur grave dans le discours de Trump d'avoir zéro mot sur la pénurie de main-d'œuvre, Monsieur le Président. C'est une crise au Québec, mais à travers le pays aussi. Et c'est pourquoi on a proposé des politiques de s'attaquer à la pénurie de main-d'œuvre, pour accélérer le processus pour les travailleurs étrangers, pour la formation en partenariat avec les provinces, Monsieur le Président. Dans mon discours, j'ai parlé sur une entreprise Atlas en Beauce, Monsieur le Président, avec une crise avec la pénurie de main-d'œuvre. Maintenant, avec une crise avec Buy American et les achats aux États-Unis, Monsieur le Président. Aucune action sur l'acier, sur l'aluminium, Monsieur le Président, et maintenant plus de tarifs pour nos entreprises. Il y a une crise de concurrence pour nos entreprises au Québec et à travers le pays. Et, Monsieur le Président, c'est seulement les conservateurs qui vont être là pour les entreprises québécoises, pour les familles québécoises, pour les aînés québécois. Nous sommes ici pour le bien-être de tous nos citoyens, Monsieur le Président.
Questions et commentaires. Questions and comments. The honourable member for Vancouver East.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the leader of the official opposition for his speech. Now, Canada is faced with an affordable housing crisis. There's no question that those who are trying to get into the market to own a home for the first time are having a real tough go at it. And we need to address that. And one of the ways in which the NDP proposes to address that is through the issue of financialization and not really treating housing as though it's a stock market. But beyond that, Mr. Speaker, there's a whole spectrum of people who are experiencing the housing crisis, those who are unhoused, who are homeless. In fact, right now, outside the Confederation building, there's a homeless man right there on the streets in the snow in the dead of winter in Ottawa. There are those who cannot afford to pay rent. I'm not talking about high-cost rent, but and for fancy apartments, but just regular apartments, and they can't even afford that. And what needs to be done is of course, to address the whole spectrum of of the housing needs, and not to mention the incredible need for Indigenous peoples who are 11 times more likely to use a shelter. Across the country, 235,000 Canadians uses a shelter each year. So my question to the Leader and to the Liberals is this: will they support the NDP's proposal to build 500,000 units of real affordable housing, including cooperative housing, so that people can get housed and get people off the streets so that they can have stability? And finally, to make sure that we actually have a for Indigenous, by Indigenous, urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question from the Honourable Member from the NDP, and I agree with her that there's no question that there's a housing crisis in Canada right now, particularly for an affordable housing crisis, first-time homebuyers crisis, a crisis of homelessness, opioids addiction. So I agree with her, Mr. Speaker. The only party that doesn't seem to acknowledge that fully is the Liberal government that has completely ignored the issue in a major way in the fall economic statement. I would also invite that member and all Canadians to look at the great program we ran on in the election, Mr. Speaker, because we're going to be talking about the 1 million new homes that are planned. We want more ambition than just 500,000, Mr. Speaker. We had a plan to give 15% of federal properties to accelerate the building of homes, including affordable homes, Mr. Speaker. We were going to tie federal infrastructure investments to density. We had a for Indigenous, by Indigenous policy in our platform, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud that we were the only party to really represent the crisis that is being faced at all levels right now, Mr. Speaker, in terms of people at the margins, first-time homebuyers, and many seniors. As I said, Canadians 30 and younger, half of that generation is giving up on home ownership, and this government is giving up on them, Mr. Speaker. Canada's Conservatives will never give up on home ownership for Canadian families, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, reprise du débat, l'honorable député de Joliette.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Tous les collègues pour
I'd
l'appui
like to thank
si bien
all of my
senti.
colleagues for their
Monsieur
great
le
support.
Président,
Mr.
au risque
Speaker,
de me répéter,
I don't want to repeat myself,
cet
but
automne, fin de l'été plutôt, on était en élection. Des élections qui étaient certainement pas nécessaires. On se disait pourquoi est-ce qu'on va en élection, à quoi ça va servir, quelles sont les priorités, qu'est-ce qui doit être demandé, qu'est-ce qui doit être changé. On se retrouve avec un portrait de la Chambre, avec encore une fois un gouvernement libéral minoritaire, donc la population a dit c'est ça qu'on veut, on veut pas, on leur fait pas assez confiance pour leur confier une majorité, ce coup-ci non plus. Monsieur le Président, au Québec, pire encore, on a gardé la même répartition, même nombre de sièges pour chaque parti. C'était des élections inutiles à un moment où on avait l'occasion de travailler, de siéger, d'assurer un suivi sur les mesures de soutien et notamment assurer le suivi sur tout ce qui avait été déposé dans le budget du printemps précédent, du mois d'avril 2021. Non, on est en élection. Après ça, Monsieur le Président, on se retrouve avec un discours du trône que je qualifierais d'insipide. Et quelle est la suite logique dans le discours du trône? Quelles étaient les visions qu'on y retrouvait? C'était quoi, là? On est au lendemain d'une élection qui était soi-disant si nécessaire. Qu'est-ce qu'on trouve là-dedans? Rien de nouveau sous le soleil, Monsieur le Président. Puis là, aujourd'hui, on a une mise à jour économique et budgétaire qu'on attendait, qui était promise dans le dernier budget. On disait qu'on en aurait une cet automne. Et franchement, quand on lit ça, elle est vraiment plus mince que ce à quoi on est habitué, tant en nombre de pages qu'en nombre de mesures, et aussi en termes de vision. C'est la suite logique de cette élection qui n'était pas nécessaire et de ce discours du trône plutôt vide. Monsieur le Président, je vous dirais, là, un gouvernement aussi à bout de souffle que ça, épuisé, qui a plus d'idées, qui propose rien de nouveau, 2 mois après les élections, qui ont eux-mêmes déclenché. Ça n'a pas de bon sens, c'est du jamais vu, c'est décourageant. Il y a 5 jours, Monsieur le Président, toutes les provinces se sont rassemblées autour d'une même voix dans le Conseil de la Fédération pour dire à Ottawa, régler le problème de la santé, ça prend une rencontre, ça presse, c'est urgent, c'est une priorité. Cette demande-là ne s'appuie pas sur des besoins en l'air, des demandes en l'air. Bien au contraire, si on prend par exemple les analyses du directeur parlementaire du budget, il nous rappelle année après année, puis c'est vrai, que le problème au niveau des dépenses fiscales, au niveau des budgets, se trouve dans les provinces. Pourquoi? Parce que Ottawa joue plus sa partition depuis longtemps. Ottawa ne finance pas les soins de santé à la hauteur demandée à ce qui est nécessaire. Ce qui fait que le Conference Board, le Conseil de la Fédération, le directeur parlementaire du budget, toutes les provinces le disent. Au rythme où vont les choses, parce que les dépenses en santé vont en augmentant, puis que le transfert d'Ottawa ne suit pas le rythme, puis se retire année après année. Bien, les provinces vont foncer dans un mur fiscal, Monsieur le Président, alors qu'Ottawa, à terme, malgré les dépenses extraordinaires engagées pendant la pandémie, va être dans une situation financière exceptionnelle. Tout ça a été mis, tout ça a été répété par les provinces il y a 5 jours, Monsieur le Président. Puis qu'est-ce qu'on a là-dedans? C'est quoi la réponse d'Ottawa à ça? C'est « allez vous faire voir », ni plus ni moins, Monsieur le Président. Allez vous faire voir, qu'ils disent là-dedans. Pourquoi? Parce que quand on regarde les chiffres projetés du budget, il n'y a pas une scène d'augmentation par rapport à ce qui est demandé. Ça va jusqu'en 2027, puis pas une scène miette. La réponse, c'est on déterre l'âge de guerre, allez les provinces, on s'en va sur une confrontation. Vous avez besoin de financement en santé, bien, vous n'aurez rien. Pire que ça, on a 50 pages de budget, là, si on ne compte pas les annexes là-dedans, 2-3 pages de discours, 50 pages de, comme je vous disais, dans le budget. Ils mettent 2 pages et demie à peu près à dire pourquoi vous n'aurez pas une scène de plus en santé, les provinces. Pourquoi vous n'aurez pas une scène et voici leur logique. Pendant la pandémie, on a fait des mesures de dépenses extraordinaires. Fait qu'on juge qu'on en a fait assez. Vous en avez bénéficié. Fait que là, pour jusqu'en 2027, vous n'aurez pas une scène pour la santé. Alors, logique, c'est on a payé la subvention salariale. Les gens qui recevaient payaient des taxes et des impôts dans les provinces. Fait qu'on a aidé indirectement les provinces, puis un peu directement. Je veux bien, c'était des dépenses nécessaires, c'était important, mais ça ne règle en rien le problème fondamental, le problème à terme, qui est de financer à sa juste part les dépenses en santé. Il n'y a rien qui est réglé là-dedans, puis on déclare la guerre aux provinces. C'est inacceptable, Monsieur le Président. On dénonce ça. Comme ça ne se peut pas, croyez-moi. Aussi, un point qui est soulevé dans la mise à jour. Il n'y a pas grand mesure. Il y en a certaines qu'on salue, notamment la question là, des travailleurs et travailleuses aînés. Celles et ceux qui reçoivent le supplément de revenu garanti. On a soulevé le problème avec ma collègue qui est juste ici. Depuis cet été, on a écrit à nos ministres respectifs, vis-à-vis respectifs, pendant la campagne électorale, après la campagne, encore cette semaine. On dit qu'il faut régler. J'essaie de me mettre pour qu'on puisse voir la porte-parole aînée du Bloc, mais comme on a l'image en miroir, je me mélange. Excusez-moi, Madame la Présidente. Donc, on a interpellé le gouvernement. Ils nous ont dit, oui, on va régler le problème. On leur a donné les pistes de solutions, considérer la PCU comme un revenu d'emploi pour le calcul du supplément de revenu garanti. La question des celles et ceux qui en avaient trop reçu ou qui ne devaient pas en recevoir, pouvoir le rembourser. Après ça, permettre le recalcul pour l'année en cours, que dans le fond, Service Canada et que l'Agence du revenu se parlent pour débloquer tout ça. Ils nous ont entendus, donc on leur a répété plein de fois. Puis là, ce qu'ils nous ont dit, oui, on vous écoute, mais il y a des considérations techniques. Puis ce qu'il y a dans la mise à jour, la solution qu'ils apportent est complètement différente de ce qu'on leur suggérait. On est quand même déçus de ça, Madame la Présidente, parce qu'on pense qu'on avait des bonnes pistes de solutions. Après, si étant dit, on n'est pas dans le secret des dieux. On n'a pas accès à tous les fonctionnaires, à tout l'appareil de l'État qu'a le gouvernement. Peut-être qu'il y a des considérations qui nous échappent que le gouvernement ne nous a pour l'instant pas encore transférées. Par exemple, un logiciel qui ne permettrait pas de traiter ces choses qui nous paraissent pourtant si simples. C'est ce qu'ils nous ont dit souvent tout au long de la pandémie pour les différentes mesures qu'on leur suggérait. Tout ça étant dit, quand même, ils arrivent avec une solution qui vient, dans le fond, une allocation qui serait attribuée pour compenser la perte qu'il y aurait eu. Puis là, vu qu'il n'y aurait plus de PCU dans le futur, c'est juste un an. Fait que ça réglerait, disons, un gros plaster un peu bizarre pour régler le problème. Ça pourrait fonctionner, mais on a un gros bémol ici, Madame la Présidente, c'est le délai. Là, on le sait. Ma collègue de Shefford le sait, Madame la Présidente. Les aînés qui sont aux prises avec ces situations-là vivent de graves difficultés. On a des histoires d'horreur dans chacune de nos circonscriptions ici. Des aînés qui doivent déménager, qui doivent abandonner leur logement, qui doivent vendre leur meuble, qui doivent se passer de médicaments, qui doivent entrer à l'hôpital pour pouvoir bénéficier des médicaments qui leur seraient fournis là parce qu'ils n'ont plus les moyens de se payer avec ce qui leur est retranché. Ça, c'est des situations réelles, concrètes, tangibles. Le gouvernement dit, on arrive avec une solution, c'est pas la solution que vous suggériez, mais surtout, mai prochain, on va envoyer cette allocation-là au mois de mai prochain. Ça fait depuis l'été que ça dure, donc ça va être quasiment pendant un an que ces aînés-là vont avoir été aux prises avec ces difficultés-là. Qu'est-ce qui va arriver d'ici là? C'est très inquiétant, Madame la Présidente. Ça nous préoccupe grandement, puis vous pouvez être certaine qu'on va tout faire pour essayer d'accélérer ce versement-là parce que les besoins sont trop grands. C'est des délais qu'on ne trouve pas raisonnables ni acceptables. Toujours au sujet des aînés, nous, ça fait longtemps qu'on le demande. On a dénoncé le fait que le gouvernement a créé 2 classes d'aînés. Ça, c'est inacceptable. Ça ne passe pas du tout auprès de la population aînée. Donc, on demande, non, corriger ça. On demande bonifier 110 $ par mois le paiement de sécurité de vieillesse pour tous les aînés. Une mesure simple, concrète, efficace pour soutenir celles et ceux qui ne voient, dans la plupart des cas, plus leurs revenus être ajustés à l'inflation qui atteint des niveaux records actuellement. Mais là, évidemment, pas un mot là-dessus. Donc, toujours 2 classes d'aînés, toujours pas de mesures concrètes ici pour lutter contre l'inflation. Sinon, ce qui a déjà été dit pour les autres catégories de personnes, par exemple les garderies, services de garde, quand même, là, ça ne compense pas nécessairement directement pour le panier d'épicerie. Donc, on est toujours très préoccupés pour la situation des aînés. On salue le fait qu'il y ait une solution qui soit apportée pour les problèmes de supplément de revenus garantis avec le calcul de la PCU, mais ça vient trop tard. C'est gravement problématique. Comme je vous disais, Madame la Présidente, le budget, il n'est pas bien épais. On était en huis clos là, à partir de midi moins quart. Je vous dirais qu'à 1 heure, on avait fait le tour en masse. Puis les collègues là, employés de notre formation politique, ils et elles devaient rester dans le huis clos jusqu'à 4 heures. Là, une chance qu'on avait des bonnes blagues à se raconter pour passer le temps parce qu'on avait vite fait le tour de ça. Madame la Présidente. Un élément qu'on retrouve dans le présent budget qui se retrouve repris dans l'annexe 3, donc on avait compris qu'il serait dans l'avis de voies et moyens sur lequel on devrait voter. On s'est fait dire dans les questions-réponses pendant le huis clos que l'avis de voies et moyens contenait rien d'autre. C'est ce que je suis allé dire devant les journalistes tantôt. Le temps que je revienne en chambre, l'avis de voies et moyens était déposé, puis il fait 92 pages, puis il y a toute la question de la taxation des services numériques. J'ai été surpris de voir ça, mais ça, j'y reviendrai dans quelques instants. C'est une bonne chose, mais toujours est-il dans l'énoncé, dans la mise à jour économique, dans l'annexe 3 de cette mise à jour, il y a la question, il y a une mesure qui est de taxer les résidences, donc les logements, les condos, les maisons, des propriétaires étrangers qui ne les habitent pas. L'idée, Madame la Présidente, c'est de dire, pour freiner l'inflation au niveau des logements, pour freiner la spéculation, pour rendre le logement un peu plus abordable, une petite mesure ici qui est amenée, qui est, on va mettre un incitatif pour que les personnes étrangères soient moins tentées d'acheter des logements ici sans les occuper, donc ne pas contribuer directement au premier plan à la vie économique. On est d'accord avec ce principe-là, qui est, oui, il faut faire attention, puis oui, il faut que les logements servent à la population. Mais nous, au Bloc québécois, Madame la Présidente, on soulève ici, là, on a ici un très grand bémol. Quel est-il? C'est que dans cette taxation-là, il s'agit d'une taxation foncière, d'un impôt foncier. Donc là, on aurait Ottawa, le gouvernement fédéral, qui viendrait prélever un impôt foncier pour une fin qui est certainable. Ce serait une taxe qui serait soi-disant temporaire, mais que nous a enseigné l'histoire, Madame la Présidente? À chaque fois que le gouvernement fédéral, à chaque fois qu'Ottawa s'est immiscé d'un nouveau champ de taxation, aussi petit soit-il, aussi temporaire soit-il, jamais il ne s'en est retiré et il a toujours continué à accroître cette forme de taxation-là. Dans les diverses formes de taxation qui existent, en taxe à la consommation, impôt sur le revenu, impôt sur les sociétés, etc., il en restait un à ma connaissance. Un champ fiscal qui n'était pas occupé par le gouvernement fédéral, c'est l'impôt foncier, qui était essentiellement géré par les municipalités selon la loi des provinces. Pour chez nous, Québec donne le pouvoir aux municipalités de taxer l'impôt foncier. Ottawa n'était pas présent et là, avec ce qu'il y a dans l'annexe 3 puis dans le budget, Ottawa va être présent. On a de graves inquiétudes parce que ce Léviathan a toujours la tendance à accroître sa soif d'occuper le champ fiscal. Donc ça, il faudra certainement y revenir. Et je le rappelle encore une fois, Madame la Présidente, le principe est intéressant, mais s'immiscer dans ce champ fiscal-là, c'est vraiment préoccupant pour nous au Bloc québécois. Madame la Présidente, on s'attendait, pendant la campagne électorale, quel était le thème des petites et moyennes entreprises, des commerces qu'on entendait revenir jour après jour. Mon collègue de Bécancour-Sorel, et j'oublie les autres noms de CMRC, pourrait en témoigner plus que quiconque ici, c'est la question de la pénurie de main-d'œuvre. On se disait, wow, une mise à jour économique et budgétaire dans la dernière semaine où on siège, ils vont prendre le taureau par les cornes, ils vont amener des solutions. Dans la campagne, à mon avis, le Bloc était la formation politique qui proposait le plus de solutions, s'attaquer à l'accroissement de la productivité, stimuler le retour au travail, au moins à temps partiel des aînés, mettre des mesures fiscales pour ça, accélérer tous les processus avec le ministère de l'Immigration, tant pour les travailleurs et travailleuses temporaires que permanents, et on pourrait continuer de la sorte. Oui, évidemment, l'innovation, comme je parlais de augmenter dans la productivité, ainsi de suite. Là, on a une ligne qui dit, oui, on met de l'argent pour l'immigration, là, on va essayer d'accélérer un peu le processus, mais tout le reste, on dit, bon, on va y revenir. Dans la prochaine année, là, on va arriver avec quelque chose. Franchement, là, c'était pas le temps de dire qu'on va arriver avec quelque chose dans la prochaine année. C'était le temps aujourd'hui de dire, c'est quoi qu'il y a à mettre en œuvre. Notre formation politique a donné plusieurs pistes de solutions. C'était le temps de les mettre en œuvre dans la mise à jour. Ce n'est pas le cas. On le dénonce. On est bien déçus. Comme je vous disais, ça sent le gouvernement vraiment à bout de souffle, épuisé, plus d'idées, qui ne propose rien. Juste 2 mois après son élection, c'est préoccupant. Un autre élément qui nous préoccupe, c'est évidemment la question de l'inflation. Dans le document, il y a les prévisions du secteur privé. On dit pour cette année, c'est 7,6 attendu. Donc, plus que ce qu'on voit actuellement. Donc, les prix pourraient continuer à augmenter si ces prévisions-là sont exactes. Mais au moins, point encourageant, dès l'année prochaine, ça redescend, puis les autres années après, ce serait réglé, qui était la lecture qu'on faisait de ce problème-là. Toujours est-il, on se serait attendu à avoir une plus grande préoccupation pour cet enjeu-là. On pense aux ménages à faible revenu et, comme je le disais, pour les aînés, celles et ceux qui ne voient pas leur revenu ajusté pour la hausse des prix, c'est très préoccupant. Donc, je vais juste refaire le tour de mes notes, Madame la Présidente. Il y a beaucoup de petites mesures. Par exemple, les enseignants, les éducatrices en CPE, tout ça, si elles achètent du matériel pour les jeunes, on augmente le crédit d'impôt de 15 à 25 %. C'est bien, mais il pourrait y avoir des mesures plus engageantes. Plus que ça, Madame la Présidente, un élément ici là, que je voudrais aborder. Vous vous souvenez, en avril dernier, il y a eu le budget. Ça faisait 2 ans qu'on attendait le budget. Enfin, on l'avait. Dans ça, il y avait une foule d'argent d'annoncer, une foule de mesures d'annoncer. Puis c'était gros, puis ça y allait par là. Le gouvernement l'a fait adopter. Il y avait des mesures intéressantes là-dedans, de soutien, relance verte. On s'est dit, OK, on va y aller. Après ce budget-là arrive le projet de loi C-30, mise en œuvre du budget, qui reprenait une petite partie de ce qu'il y avait dans le budget. On l'a adopté aussi. Là, on se disait, OK, attendons d'adopter la suite de ce budget-là. Le gouvernement a dit, non, on s'en va en élection. Puis là, après l'élection, ils font campagne sur les mesures qui étaient dans le budget qu'on avait adopté. Puis là, on arrive avec la mise à jour. Puis là, la mise à jour, elle ne reprend pas ces éléments-là. C'est comme des promesses électorales qui ont servi à une campagne électorale. On finit la campagne électorale, on a la mise à jour, donc le mini-budget. Puis là, on les a pu. Madame la Présidente, le budget du printemps dernier annonçait 52 mesures législatives. 52. 100 pages de mesures fiscales. 100 pages de mesures fiscales, Madame la Présidente. La majorité de ça, c'était pas dans ces 30 qu'on a adopté, puis ça se retrouve pas dans l'énoncé. Fait que c'est quoi, là, dans cette mise à jour-là que le gouvernement est en train de nous dire? C'est que, finalement, tout ce qu'on vous a annoncé dans le budget précédent, c'était pour se faire élire, pour avoir une majorité. On n'a pas eu notre majorité. Vous vouliez qu'on reste minoritaire. On retire ce budget-là. C'est ça le message qui est envoyé ici. C'est bien inquiétant, évidemment. Ça fait gouvernement, pas de vision, pas en tout. J'en reviens pas. Moi, c'est ma 3e élection. Puis c'est la première fois que je vois ça, un retour en chambre, retour tardif. Là. Il a fallu attendre 2 mois pour revenir. Puis là, les ministres sont nommés en retard aussi. Puis oui, il va avoir le discours du trône. Puis il est bien court, il n'y a pas grand-chose, il est bien plate, surtout de la façon qu'il était vu. Mais ça, c'est la fonction de la personne qui le lisait, qui doit... le lire comme ça. Donc ça, on n'aura pas trop de critiques à ce sujet-là, mais dans la mise à jour, c'est la suite logique. C'est un gouvernement bof. Il faut y aller, on y va, on est fatigué. La machine ne marche plus, là. Un peu de pep, là. Si vous n'avez pas d'idée, pas vous, Madame la Présidente, si le gouvernement n'a pas d'idée, nous autres, on a de l'énergie. Écoutez-nous, puis on va vous en proposer des projets de loi à mettre en œuvre. À commencer, Madame la Présidente, par régler la question de la santé. Quand on regarde les sondages, c'est le sujet numéro 1. C'est pas des conditions imposées aux provinces qu'on veut, c'est des transferts, c'est ce que les provinces demandent. Régler ça, ça presse, puis régler la situation des aînés. Donc là, j'attends vos questions. Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Kings Head.
Madame la Présidente, et je veux remercier mon collègue de Joliette pour son discours ce matin, pas ce matin, cet après-midi. Et je pense que tous les membres de cette Chambre pensent qu'un système de santé, soins de santé robuste est très bien. Mais je pense que nous parlons avec les augmentations des fonds nécessaires pour s'assurer que le système de santé est bien. c'est nécessaire pour créer un plan durable. Et est-ce que le député soutient-il la réduction de barrières commerciales interprovinciales pour créer le revenu nécessaire pour s'assurer que les investissements de soins de santé soient durables?
L'honorable député de Joliette.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je remercie mon collègue pour sa question et son commentaire. Je vais commencer par la fin de son intervention. La question là, des barrières interprovinciales, ça concerne les négociations entre les provinces. Entre elles, ça leur appartient. Nous, au Bloc québécois, ce qu'on veut, c'est respecter les champs de compétences. Parce que qu'est-ce qu'on voit? C'est que Papa Ottawa s'immisce toujours dans le jardin d'encours d'un champ de compétences des provinces, ici des municipalités, dans cette mise à jour-là qu'on voit. Fait qu'on dit, non, faites votre part comme il faut, par exemple sur les frontières, par exemple sur le financement de la santé. Pour avoir un financement d'un système de santé durable, ça prend un financement adéquat. Nous, on est au diapason des besoins des provinces. On est au diapason des analyses du directeur parlementaire du budget qui dit, « Hey, les amis, si vous voulez que les systèmes soient durables, ben, ça prend une équité et ça passe par un transfert d'Ottawa sans condition pour les systèmes de santé. C'est hyper important. Là, c'est pas tous les membres de cette Chambre ou les députés de cette Chambre, Madame la Présidente, qui disent on est pour ça, un système de santé durable. Certainement pas la ministre des Finances qui a écrit sa mise à jour, parce que dans la mise à jour, on n'a pas d'augmentation pour le système de santé. On reste à 3 qui est en bas de l'accroissement des coûts. Alors que ce que les provinces puis ce que tout le monde demande, c'est un rattrapage, arriver à 35 du financement, puis après ça, augmenter à 6 par année pour maintenir la hausse. C'est ça que ça prend, c'est ça dont on a besoin. Et la ministre des Finances et ce gouvernement se trouvent aujourd'hui avec la mise à jour à déclarer la guerre aux provinces. Puis nous autres, notre camp est choisi, c'est du bord du monde, c'est du bord du financement de la santé, c'est pas du bord du gouvernement là-dessus. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Merci, Madame Speaker. Ça marche? Oui, parfait. Je voulais aussi remercier mon collègue le député de Joliette pour ses commentaires. My question is specifically around knowing that we've had an incident of climate-fueled weather events across the country and in Quebec as well over recent years. Noting in this fiscal update, there's only one mention of climate adaptation. It's for a strategy to be developed by the end of next year. Wondering if the member would comment on his thoughts around the need for the federal government to be doing more around climate adaptation.
Honorable député de Joliette.
Oui, merci, Madame la Présidente. Je remercie mon collègue de Kitchener Centre pour son intervention et je suis tout à fait d'accord avec lui. Pour l'environnement, dans cette mise à jour-là, il y avait des mesures annoncées dans le budget du printemps dernier. Et même, on s'attendait à ce que la relance, le sortir de la pandémie, tout ça, ça passe par le verdissement, la carboneutralité de notre économie, un grand virage environnemental. Nous, au Bloc, on a plein de projets là-dessus. Par exemple, un projet de finances vertes pour mobiliser le secteur privé à financer ce virage-là. Finalement, ce qu'on a vu quand on a arrêté de siéger au printemps dernier, ça a été des annonces partout au Canada, tout l'été, pour toutes sortes de projets qui n'étaient vraiment pas souvent pour l'environnement. On a clairement pas vu ce tournant vers là de l'économie qui aurait pu être mis en place. Et cette mise à jour-là est la continuité de l'intention du gouvernement qui est finalement, si c'est un slogan qui marche en campagne électorale, on y va. Sinon, on s'en lave les mains. Merci.
And I apologize to the Honourable Member for Elmwood-Transcona. Anyway, the Honourable Member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je sais qu'une des choses dont le Bloc a parlé pendant le débat sur C2, c'était la question des travailleurs autonomes dans le secteur des arts et culture. Nous avons parlé beaucoup des aînés sur le supplément de revenus garanti. On voit des propos dans cette déclaration économique pour ces deux enjeux-là, mais ils sont très vagues. Il n'y a pas vraiment de détails. Moi, j'ai un peu peur que ce que le gouvernement a en tête ne ferait pas une solution adéquate pour les aînés qui ont déjà eu leur supplément de revenu garanti repris par le gouvernement. Puis je veux savoir qu'est-ce que mon collègue pense du programme VEG qui a été annoncé pour les travailleurs dans le secteur des arts et culture. Est-ce qu'ils ont confiance au gouvernement libéraux pour bien livrer un tel programme?
Honorable député de Joliette.
Oui, merci, Madame la Présidente. Je tiens à remercier mon collègue de Elmwood Transcona. Excusez-moi, j'ai plus l'habitude de l'appeler par son prénom parce que j'ai le plaisir de siéger avec lui au comité des finances. Et je peux vous dire, on a siégé de façon intensive dans la dernière semaine au comité. J'ai pu voir à quel point c'est un député travaillant, brillant, qui a le désir de servir la population. Il est là pour les bonnes raisons et avec bien du talent, donc je le salue. Puis, oui, il soulève des bons éléments. La question du supplément de revenu garanti avec le problème de la PCU, là, il y a une solution qui est amenée ici. Avec les réponses qu'on a obtenues des fonctionnaires au brefage, pour nous, ça semble régler le problème, même si ce n'est pas les solutions qu'on avait envisagées. Il reste une grande inquiétude, c'est la question du délai. Les fonctionnaires nous ont dit que ça serait l'allocation serait envoyée au mois de mai. Pour nous, ça paraît un délai inacceptable. Évidemment, on va continuer à regarder ça. Pour la question des travailleuses et travailleurs autonomes du secteur de la culture, c'est pas dans la mise à jour. Ce qui est annoncé là, c'est autre chose qui répond à une demande qu'on avait faite il y a déjà plus d'un an. Ce que le ministre du Patrimoine est venu nous dire en comité, pour moi, pour nous, à notre formation, ça nous rassure. Et évidemment, on a bien hâte de voir ce programme ciblé-là qui sera amené par le gouvernement et par le ministre du Patrimoine. Pour nous, c'était essentiel. C'était une condition de notre appui à ces deux qui porte sur la suite des subventions salariales. Et évidemment, même si la ministre, dans son discours, a fait des liens avec ces deux, la mise à jour n'est pas ces deux. Il ne faut pas se mélanger entre les deux. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Député de Shefford.
The honourable member for Shefford.
Mon honorable collègue de Joliette.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for Joliette.
qu'Ottawa a lancé la guerre face aux provinces dans la question de la santé.
My colleague said that Ottawa has declared war on the provinces when it comes to health funding, and now it has essentially also declared war on seniors who are still in a precarious situation as they were before the pandemic, which has only made things worse.
Les aînés, on a tendance à les aider sur des situations ponctuelles. Pendant la pandémie, qu'est-ce qu'on a fait? Un chèque une fois. Est-ce que ça a réglé la situation? Non, Madame la Présidente. Après, on a trouvé une solution pour les aînés de 75 ans et plus. Un chèque une fois avant la campagne électorale. C'est électoraliste, c'est insultant. Les aînés ont été insultés. Et là, en 2021, que les fonctionnaires ne soient pas capables de trouver une solution ici, autant pour les aînés que pour les travailleurs culturels, j'ai été au comité de la finance vendredi. On s'est fait répondre la même chose. C'est trop compliqué. C'est pas normal.
We weren't able to get answers at the Finance Committee. It's ridiculous.
Un autre endroit où le gouvernement devrait investir, on est encore en crise. C'est la santé, les aînés, deux endroits qui ont été touchés par la pandémie de plein fouet. Quoi? Deux chiffres en pleine face. Du droit du gauche. Je devrais l'entendre pour voir si c'est normal en 2021. On n'avait pas plus d'écoute que ça.
I'm very upset to see that in 2021 this is still how the
député de Joliette.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je remercie ma collègue de Shefford pour sa question, pour son intervention. On sent tout l'engagement qu'elle a dans la parole qu'elle porte en cette Chambre pour les gens qu'on défend, nous, ici, dans notre formation au Bloc québécois. Par exemple, les aînés. Ça n'a pas de bon sens, Madame la Présidente. Ça n'a pas de bon sens. Excusez-moi, je suis vraiment ému de l'intervention de ma collègue députée de Shefford. Oui, ça a été à la pièce. Ça a été OK, on va en donner un petit peu. C'est quoi le minimum qu'on peut donner pour se sauver en face? OK, on va y aller avec ça. Nous autres, ce qu'on demande, c'est pour ça que ça fait longtemps qu'on l'a souligné. Quand on regarde la question du taux de remplacement du revenu de la période active à la retraite, quand on regarde l'augmentation pour tenir compte de l'inflation année après année, du pouvoir d'achat des aînés, ça se détériore. On veut régler la situation durablement. Mon temps est épuisé, Madame la Présidente. Je vous remercie. C'est une question, un sujet à suivre, puis on sera là. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Resuming debate on the honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Les Canadiens et les Canadiennes aujourd'hui font face à des défis économiques très, très sérieux. Ils le voient dans le prix des épiceries, ils le voient dans le prix de logement, ils voient dans les difficultés de trouver un emploi au même temps qu'il y a des employeurs qui ont des difficultés à trouver des employés. Et le Canada est à un croisé des chemins. Nous avons des questions une question de comment nous construisons une reprise économique de la pandémie juste. Nous avons des grandes questions sur le sujet du crise climatique et comment on peut effectuer une transition juste par rapport au climat et les travailleurs. Et c'est un moment qui demande du leadership.
We are at a crossroads that requires
Cette mise à jour
leadership.
économique était une opportunité ou une occasion de mettre en évidence cette sens de leadership
would have been a time to show that leadership from this
Mais
government.
au lieu, nous avons eu qu'est-ce qui est effectivement une défense du statu quo.
We essentially
C'est
saw
pas un statu quo
a defense of the status
innocent
quo.
ou parce que
And
c'est un
this is not
statu
a
quo
harmless status quo.
qui travaille
No.
très très bien pour les plus
It is a
riches
status quo that
et
is
qui
working
fait
very
la
well
vie
for
très
the
difficile
wealthiest,
pour les travailleurs et les
but that is
travailleuses.
making life very difficult for workers.
Alors, nous voulons avoir des solutions
Therefore,
du
we
gouvernement
want to see
et on le voit
solutions from
pas
this government.
dans cette
But we're not getting that in this
mise à
economic
jour
update.
économique. Et selon nous, ici au NPD, quand
According
nous
to
parlons
us in
des
the
grandes
NDP,
questions économiques, c'est très important
When
que
we talk
l'unité
about
de
broad
base de
economic
notre analyse soit
we
les
need to
personnes
ensure
qui sont les
that
plus
the
vulnérables,
basic thing that we're analyzing is how
soit
to help those who are most
dans un sens
vulnerable,
financier, ou les travailleurs et travailleuses qui
financially
peut-être ont un peu d'argent, mais avec des
or for
pressions,
workers
comme on
who
voit
may
avec
have some savings
l'inflation, demande si
or a
c'est
slightly higher income, but who are experiencing
autant
pressures
qu'ils
due
ont
to
besoin
inflation,
pour
and who may be wondering if they
payer
have enough to pay
tous
the
les
bills.
factures. So we're kind of at a crossroads as a country, just as we are as a world, Madam Speaker, where we are, some will tell you, and depending on the day, the Liberals will tell you that we're out of the pandemic and that the economy is back to normal and everything's good. And then when it suits their purpose, they'll tell you actually what most people know to be true anyway, which is that we're not out of the pandemic. That some things are better, but many things are still very bad, and people are still looking to find their way collectively, whether it's at the level of a country or a province, a city, a community, and individually, how they fit into what is becoming a new economy. A new economy coming out of the pandemic, to be sure, and some of the pressures that we still face around supply chains and other things that have been caused by the pandemic, but an economy that was already going to change because of climate change. And we've seen so much evidence. I look to my colleagues that are seated around me from BC who know all too well the real cost of climate and the economic consequences and the real financial cost of not dealing with climate change. So here we are at that crossroads, trying to figure out what this recovery is going to look like. Recovery from the pandemic and transition into a sustainable economy that can mitigate as much as possible the impact of climate change. And New Democrats believe that in all of this pain and all of this challenge is an opportunity to build the infrastructure and the framework for a more just economy and a better Canada. One that recognizes that it is wrong to have an economy that now, and we just heard this from the Parliamentary Budget Officer last week, sees 25% of all the wealth produced in this country go to just 1% of the population, and asks 40% of all the people in this country to share just 1%. That wasn't always the case. And that is getting worse and worse and worse. So when we see the government defend a status quo that's creating those kinds of outcomes, you have to know it's not just defending 25% of the wealth going to 1%, it's defending the trend line that continues to see more and more of that wealth go to fewer and fewer people. And while Canada's economic pie has been growing, the proportion that goes to the 1% at the top has been growing much faster, leaving less and less for the rest of us, Madam Speaker. And so as we come out of the pandemic to the extent that we are, and I would say to the government, we are not anywhere near as far out of the pandemic as they sometimes like to pretend. And as we venture into this uncertain future with so many more extreme weather events as a result of climate change, we need to make sure that we're getting the principles right that will ensure that everybody gets to partake in a prosperous future, not just the people who already own all of the important assets. The word there is capitalism. We've had less and less regulation of the market. We've had less and less fair taxation, which has allowed the people that own assets to continue to own more and more and more. And unless there's a way to rein that in, eventually we'll get to a point where what is shared between the rest of us isn't enough for most of us. So that's why I'm very proud to be the finance critic for a party that's talking about a pandemic excess profits tax that recognizes that while many businesses have suffered through the pandemic, there are some that have done extraordinarily well when compared to their pre-pandemic performance, and that it would make sense to ask them to pay a little bit more on that extra that they've made in order to help some of the things we need to get us the rest of the way out of the pandemic and to build a just future. That's why I'm proud to be the finance critic for a party that ran on imposing a 1% wealth tax on fortunes of over $20 million. That's not a lot of people, but it's a lot of money. And it's a lot of money that can do a lot of good. And it's money that's going to people who benefit from the investments that we all make in public infrastructure. So it is right and good that when they receive such a disproportionate amount of the benefit, that they would pay proportionally more in order to create that infrastructure. And to do things that protect people at the bottom. There's been a lot of talk about inflation in this place over the last 3.5 weeks. Well, the fact of the matter is that the money that went to the financially vulnerable isn't what's driving inflation. It wasn't the CERB payments. It wasn't the wage subsidy payments. They bought groceries. They paid bills. They fixed their car. The people that were on the wage subsidy got 75% of what they were used to making. I don't know how you cause inflation when you've got a 25% decrease in your salary. So let us not pretend that the help that went to people who needed it is the cause of the inflation here. And the reason why that matters is because those folks are still hurting and they still need help. That's right. It's why it was wrong of the government to cut the CRB with just 2 days' notice. But it's also why it's wrong for them to be dragging their heels on promises like a Canada Disability benefit, something that they promised a while ago now, that people living with disabilities in Canada who aren't able to work need in order to be able to live a life with dignity. It's why they should be doing the same for seniors on the guaranteed income supplement. We've talked a little bit about the clawbacks, but I want to talk about the fact that even when it's not being clawed back, the guaranteed income supplement does not provide enough for a person to live at the poverty line. That's why it's still below the poverty line. And that is all part and parcel of working toward a time in Canada where we can have a livable basic income for everyone who needs it in Canada. We got close with the CERB. It was an interesting time, and that's why it's such an important moment, because we can say these were just temporary things, and we're out of the worst of it now. We're going to drop all these people like a brick again and get back to the status quo that led us to the point where 1% of people own 25% of the wealth, or it could be an opportunity to say that we learned how to do things differently, and that was an important moment in our history. And notwithstanding some of the very real problems with the way programs were delivered, the principle is an important lesson for our future. Today, the Liberals could have taken some real action on one of the things, the structural things that's driving inflation in Canada right now, which is in the housing market. Anyone knows, I mean, whether it's somebody trying to get into the housing market or whether it's parents that are contemplating the future of their children, everyone is worried about the housing market. And we know that a record amount of the mortgages now in Canada are actually by investors. And there are things that the government could be seriously considering, like a moratorium on real estate investment trusts, acquiring more property while the market is so hot. They could be creating an acquisition fund so that nonprofits that are in the business of creating social housing and other forms of more affordable housing could compete with some of these investors in the market to snap up buildings and land as it becomes available. Those are some of the things that they could do now in order to help bring down the temperature on the housing market and create some hope for Canadians for the future, that even if they can't afford a home tomorrow, we're on a trajectory that will allow them or their children to afford a home in 5 to 10 years. But there's nothing in here that talks about that. There's a little bit of poking around the edges, but we're in a difficult time, and it calls for real leadership and real measures. When we talk about affordability, I mean, what is one of the biggest cost pressures for Canada's seniors? It's the price of prescription drugs. And the Liberals promised an answer to this as long ago as 1997. The temptation is to get tired of talking about it because we talk about it so much and it doesn't happen. But that would be a victory for the Liberals who have cynically promised it so often, and it would be a victory for the pharmaceutical industry that would like nothing more than for the NDP to shut up about pharmacare so that they can get on making their money without having to worry that one day we're going to do right by Canadians and organize our purchasing and make sure everyone's covered and actually save money. Hear, 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 hear. And I hope I get to see the day when we do that with dental care as well. There are opportunities when we talk about what to do to create employment and to fight inflation when it comes to the climate challenge as well. We ought to be out there helping people retrofit their homes to make them more efficient, to transition the way that they heat their homes off of fossil fuels. And if we do it in the right way, particularly for lower income households, we could do it in a way where they realize savings in their monthly budget. That's an investment that we absolutely have to make if we're ever going to have a hope of realizing our emission reduction targets. And it's something that could actually provide some tangible financial relief to households that are struggling right now. What better time to do it, Madam Speaker? And yet, we don't see anything here. Also, committing to a large-scale, ambitious retrofit project and a real nation-building project that's actually not about building a pipeline, but about building other critical things that we need, like a Western power grid that would allow for solar and wind energy produced in Alberta and Saskatchewan to work collaboratively with the hydro energy that we have on either end of our Western region. That's something that can create a lot of jobs. And the ambitious retrofit program together with that can create a work forecast that would allow employers in the trades to plan well into the future and, working with government, train a whole generation of tradespeople that are working on environmentally sustainable infrastructure, helping us reduce our emissions and having good, well-paid jobs, building the future economy of Canada. What better time to do that? What better time to do that than now, Madam Speaker? And yet there's hardly a mention of the climate crisis in this economic statement. You'd think it hadn't happened. There's money, much needed money, for our brothers and sisters in British Columbia who are hurting after the severe weather events there, but that's just a response to what's happening. And as we heard earlier in the House here, the only proactive thing they talk about is coming up with another plan. I don't know how many times we're going to have to hear about the next great plan that the Liberals are going to come up with to finally start reducing emissions, while we're an embarrassment in the OECD with the highest emission increases. Yeah. Stop with the plans. Pick something and do it. This has been researched to death. When we talk about inflation, we're also talking about supply chains. And particularly, we're talking about the exposure of supply chains to things like the pandemic, which we saw, but also to the climate crisis. And we saw that in BC. And one of the inflationary pressures in Canada right now is at the Port of Vancouver that was decimated by the extreme weather events there. One solution that the government might adopt when we talk about supply chains and trying to reduce the extent to which Canadians are exposed to that kind of international pressure, is to actually talk about things that we want to make here. We heard during the pandemic that we had a hard time getting personal protective equipment and other essential medical goods. And there are a lot of Canadian companies that were lining up to say, we can do that work. Yeah. We can do that here. We would love nothing more than to train Canadians to do that work in our facilities. We can scale up. All we need is for the government to choose to invest in us instead of giving more money to multinational companies that have been offshoring their manufacturing for decades. So invest in us, invest in Canadian success stories, and we can do it. And that wasn't the path that the government chose. There's nothing here about talking about how we could reshore some important manufacturing. I just went to Washington, where they're contemplating things, and Canada is going to be collateral damage in their effort to reshore. But I'll tell you, we're at a disadvantage in a place like Washington because we can't talk about our automotive strategy. We can't talk about what we're going to do to ensure that future generations of Canadians get to work in a high-paying, highly unionized, not a coincidence, incidentally, sector in Canada, because we don't have a plan. So instead, we just keep reacting to what other people are doing. And that means that the U.S. is going to continue to drive the agenda, and we're going to have to continue, jumping up and down to get their attention to try and be at the table. What would be helpful would be to say, this is Canada's plan. We are looking, there's a lot of talk these days about, producing batteries for electric vehicles. Well, if Canada's going to get serious about that, we're going to need partners. China's knocking on the door. Germany's knocking on the door. The U.S. should be knocking on the door. I would love for the government to be able to show them the National Automotive Plan for Canada that's continuing our long partnership with the United States, and the one that sees Canada end up partnering with China or Germany and say, look, this is our preferred option to continue the well-integrated automotive sector that we have. Don't cut us out. And I can tell you, I believe that would have been a far more effective argument in Washington, but we refused to plan. I'm from Winnipeg, where the aerospace industry is important, just as it's important to the province of Quebec and other areas. We don't have a national plan. And we saw our government scramble in the pandemic, not knowing really what to do. And aside from the wage subsidy, which, unfortunately, the Liberals weren't open to taking advice on how to close loopholes, so ended up being abused in a number of ways. But other than the wage subsidy, there was no sense of urgency that it was important that Canada maintain passenger air service, even though we're one of the largest countries in the world with the most distance to travel. Even this place to work, for people to be represented in the House of Commons well from each part of the country requires a well-functioning passenger air service. It's a fundamental strategic asset of Canada, and yet the government had no plan, continues to have no plan. There's one-off little, doling out of money here and there, but there's no cohesive strategy for how such a strategic sector is going to be maintained and the benefits maximized. So those are just some of our reflections on this side of the House about the fall economic statement. And I think, as you can tell, Madam Speaker, the real problem with it is just not unlike the speech from the throne. We had this election because the government said, we're at a pivotal point in our history and there are big decisions that we have to make that go above and beyond what we're already doing in the House of Commons. So we have to go to the Canadian people, we have to get a mandate to meh. That's what we got out of that $600 million election that nobody except for the Prime Minister wanted. We saw that in the speech from the throne. We've seen it now in the so-called fiscal update. And it's just not good enough for the moment that we find ourselves in, where more and more Canadians are struggling to get by, while people at the top take a larger and larger share of the economic pie, while Canada is a laggard in reducing its emissions. And we've got a housing market that's getting out of control and a government that has no real proposals about what to do about it. When you look at other countries, Like New Zealand, for instance, has brought in a policy that says if you already own one home, the down payment you're going to need for your next home is going to be larger. And the next one after that, even larger. And so on. In order to discourage people from going out and who are in a financial position to snap up properties from doing it. To make sure that more people can be in a financial position to get their family home. That's just one example of a government that's clearly serious about doing something and is being creative. There's some creative work at the municipal level we see in the city of Vancouver, former NDP MP, I might add, who's the mayor there, that is doing some interesting work and trying to figure out how to enable more density on residential lots, not so that developers can take all of that money. They're going to get some of that money. This is the worry. I mean, I think people, the guys at the top always seem to be worried that they're not going to make any money. There's a lot of money to be made while you pay your fair share. We're not talking about them not making any money. We're talking about them making a fair amount of money and ensuring that they're reinvesting in the communities and the infrastructure that allows them to make that money in the first place. And ensuring that the people who live in the communities around their developments are able to live in dignity even if they can't buy the premium apartment on the top floor. That's what we're talking about. That's a vision for Canada I think most Canadians can get behind, but it's not one that's going to happen spontaneously on its own. It's one that's going to take some leadership. It's one that's going to take good public administration and good public policy instead of the kind of chaotic mess that we've seen here over the last number of weeks with a government that can hardly get its own legislation through the House. So, we're here to try and hold the government to account. We're here until we are the government, which I hope happens soon, to try and help them be their best selves, because it can make a big difference in the lives of a lot of Canadians. We see that with the Guaranteed Income Supplement. We have an announcement today, which is the result of a lot of public pressure. It wasn't a negotiated solution, you know that, because it's not the solution we proposed. But it is some kind of solution, and we have yet to see the details, and we're hoping that it's going to actually help. We're hoping that it's going to help quickly, but we need more. And I wish they'd stop hanging on to it for the big reveal. You know, there are some people that are living in their car waiting for that reveal who would much rather be in a home. So let's get on with get past the suspense and the build-up, and let's get to the project of getting those people back in a home as they were just 4 months ago, before the government decided callously to claw back their GIS benefit. So that's why this is a very dissatisfying economic statement. And I hope for Canadians listening, if they don't take anything else away from this speech, it's to say that there are people in this place who are thinking about real actions that the government could actually take. We're not all just here to blow steam. We're also here to do a real job and to try and find the policies that are going to find their way to them and make a concrete difference in their life. And we're here to continue to apply that pressure and make sure that those things really happen instead of kind of passing by in a sound clip on the news and then people here thinking that the issue is settled. We're here to remind the government these issues are not settled. They won't be settled until there's real action. That's what we're here to push for. And we're going to keep pushing. We're going to keep pushing for some of these concrete things to be in their budget. They've missed the opportunity on the speech from the throne. They missed it in the fall economic statement. Let's be damn sure to have some of it in the budget. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for King's Heads.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his remarks here today. A couple things that I certainly heard from the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance that he seems to have not either heard during her remarks was the fact that we've actually returned 106% of the jobs pre-pandemic. I mean, our government has been there to help grow the economy. And my question to him, he certainly talked about Canadians needing support. We know that Omicron is certainly something that we're watching. We know that countries around the world are taking this seriously. We have small businesses in my riding that are mom and pop type of tourism related businesses that this member just voted against. And so can that member explain why he and his party, through you, Madam Speaker, would have voted against a measure that would actually support small businesses and the individuals that he certainly said that he supported and wants our government to be supporting more?
Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Sure, I would talk about the folks in my riding who also work in the tourism industry, that in an industry that's 85% women, who are independent travel agents that work out of their basement or their home office, and there's nothing in there for them. So don't pretend, because we've heard this again and again and again. And the fact is, look, we support getting help in the way that the government says they want to help certain businesses. It's not that we don't want the help to be there for them, but this divide and conquer strategy of the Liberals to hive off certain groups and deliver help to them while abandoning other people like independent travel agents, like a lot of people who are working in the arts and culture sector who are still waiting on some kind of program when all they had to do was be included in the Canada Worker Lockdown benefit. Without the requirement for a lockdown. There are ways that government could be delivering help to a lot more people who really need it. Bill C-2 is about the basic structure of Canada's recovery, and it's a complete failure from that point of view. So stop with the pretending that somehow we're against helping the few people the government wants to help, when we're clearly making a statement about the nature of the recovery and all the other people that need help that this government isn't there for.
The honourable member for Tobique-Matiquak.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a real privilege to rise in the House, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his remarks and his passion that he's displaying here on the floor of the House. I'm sure he shares along with me and several of us here on this side of the House the concern for the rising cost of living and the impact that this is having on young families and in particular our seniors. The dream of owning a home for our young couples and families that are wanting to get started and have that seems to be getting further and further out of reach. And for our seniors, they're not making enough to even keep up with the rising cost of living on a regular basis, let alone the inflationary pressures that's putting on increased gas prices as well as increased costs for heating their homes and getting groceries. So I'd ask the honourable member if he shares those concerns and any comments he may have on that.
Honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I certainly do share those concerns, and it's part of why the NDP has been such a loud and consistent advocate, for instance, for seniors who have seen their GIS clawed back. It's why we've been talking for a while now about trying to get the guaranteed income supplement level up to the poverty line so that our most vulnerable seniors aren't legislated into a life of poverty. When it comes to housing, I mentioned some of the initiatives that we've been contemplating in my remarks. I would be curious to hear some concrete measures from the Conservatives that might actually help. I mean, you guys are good on the critique right now, but on the solutions, we haven't actually heard a lot that would make a big difference, including on inflation. I mean, there's a lot of talk about the impact of inflation, and we share your concern about the impact of inflation. But your finance critic is very adamant that we need to not talk about things like a dual employment mandate like they have in the States, or having some more interesting mandate ideas like what they have in New Zealand, where they've asked their central bank to consider housing prices in the way that they set monetary policy. Instead, he was very focused on the 2% inflation target, which is what is going to cause the rise in interest rates that your leader was just talking about earlier today, that their leader, pardon me, Madam Speaker, was talking about just earlier today. And those interest rates in the current economy, and given how stretched Canadians already are, will also cause a real crisis for those who were able to buy into what is a really hot market. They're not going to be able to sustain their home if we see massive interest rate hikes, which is what it means to doggedly pursue a 2% inflation target. So there's some big discussions we need to have here. I know Conservatives have been big on the critical side lately, but I think you guys really got to get your act together on proposing some solutions, because that's where the dialogue on that side of the House, Madam Speaker, is falling apart.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Beauport, Côte-de-Beaupré, d'Orléans-Charlevoix.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je salue le plaidoyer de mon collègue.
speech.
Je salue également sa grande volonté d'apporter dans cette Chambre des propositions concrètes et pour aider les citoyens que nous représentons. Alors, je le remercie infiniment pour sa passion. J'aimerais lui poser une question à propos des transferts en santé. Je pense que ce n'est plus quelque chose on se pose plus la question à quel point, avant la pandémie, chaque province et le Québec rencontraient déjà des problèmes en matière de financement de santé et que la pandémie a exacerbé. Maintenant, au Bloc québécois, ça fait longtemps qu'on est derrière le Québec, derrière les provinces également, parce que c'est à l'unanimité. On demande une augmentation des transferts en santé immédiate, urgente et sans condition. C'est vraiment là-dessus que je vais entendre mon collègue. On n'a pas à apprendre du gouvernement fédéral comment soigner nos gens, ni comment gérer nos hôpitaux. On a besoin d'argent pour le faire. J'aimerais l'entendre là-dessus.
L'honorable député d'Elmwood-Transcona.
The honorable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Quand je me suis présenté pour la première fois
pour être député à la Chambre des communes en 2015, une des raisons que je me suis présenté, c'était parce que j'ai trouvé la position du gouvernement Harper inacceptable. I found what they were doing was unacceptable. I thought that health care increases of 3% only were unacceptable.
Le Premier ministre disait que c'était
inacceptable. At that time, the Prime Minister was saying that was also unacceptable. But as soon as he became Prime Minister, he adopted the Harper government's policies. So yes, we do need a health care increase. It's something the NDP has supported for quite some time, and it's something that we want to see. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House
Speaker. And, the member made reference to the fact that, the government needs to have some sort of a retrofit housing program, one that has energy efficiency, and he's disappointed that we didn't have that. Well, let me alleviate the disappointment. We actually have a program. 700,000 applicants are expected in terms of grants that are going to be coming out. It is all about making homes more energy efficient. It's good for the economy. It's good for the environment. It's good for our housing stock. It's providing people, for many people, that would not have the finances in order to be able to do what it is that they're doing. I'm wondering if the member would at the very least acknowledge his dream of having something of this nature is actually a reality, and it's a good thing, and that he would support that, much like he should be supporting C2, but that's another issue.
The Honourable Member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, I'm happy to acknowledge that it's a real talking point of the Liberal Party, as was a national housing strategy, which continues to be a dream of the NDP. But what we found was that when the time came to deliver the money and to actually get the work done, this government wasn't able to deliver. Also, I'd asked for an ambitious program, and by that I mean one that's actually getting the work done. And when I start hearing about it in my community, that people are amazed at how many homes are getting done in our neighborhoods where people are upgrading their homes, changing the way they heat their home, then we will have arrived. But just hearing about it in the House of Commons because 700,000 applicants over a country of 40 million, when we don't actually, and I notice he used the term applicants, and there is a lot of weasel words in this place, Madam Speaker, so I wonder how many of those applicants are actually going to see a successful delivery of the program. So I'll believe it when I see it. I recognize that they're talking that way, just as they've talked about pharmacare for decades now. And when people in my community start telling me how happy they are that their friends, and their relatives are able to retrofit their home, that's when I know we'll have arrived.
Questions and we don't have time for questions and comments. My apologies. It being 6:22, pursuant to order made on Monday, December 6th, 2021, the House stands adjourned until tomorrow at 2 p.m. pursuant to Standing Order 24-1.